Chapter 572. 5 days passed in the blink of an eye. In the silent ice cave, Aisha looked at Dean, who was naked from the waist up and had a red complexion. She said with satisfaction, "Very good. You can already control the flow of blood freely. It can be said that you have mastered the dragon blood technique. However, your heart muscle is not strong enough. If you practice more in the future, I believe that with your understanding, you will soon be able to reach the point where dragon blood bursts and beast blood boils." Dean only felt that his whole body was hot, as if he was being baked in the scorching heat. He was no longer cold. However, to maintain such a hot body temperature, the heart needed to breathe in and release at the same time. The so-called breathe in and release at the same time was to control the main blood vessels connected to the heart to carry out different tasks. On one hand, the blood was sucked in and out of the body, and on the other hand, the blood was sucked in and out of the body. This made the blood flow in the body maintain a circular whirlpool. The load on the heart was extremely high, no less than 500 beats per minute. With the current strength of his heart muscle, he could barely maintain this state for less than 10 minutes before feeling intense fatigue. But the effect of this was surprisingly obvious. First of all, his body temperature rose sharply. Even though he had the ice blood disease, he could still feel the strong heat. Second, the increase in strength. As Aisha said, the dragon blood technique was a secret technique to increase strength and fine-tune the body. Under the condition of blood circulation in the body, he felt that his whole body had endless strength. He seemed to be in the peak state of anger at all times. This point alone was enough to make the dragon blood technique a secret technique. It was the heart muscle that controlled the blood in the body. This meant that if a person was injured or physically weak, as long as he mastered the dragon blood technique, he could immediately return to his peak state. If he fought with an enemy of similar strength, he could use the dragon blood technique when his physical strength was almost exhausted, and then he could return to his peak state. Just this point alone was enough to completely crush those of the same cultivation level as him. If Aisha hadn't been poisoned, which happened to restrain the dragon blood technique, she wouldn't have fallen into such a difficult situation. After all, she had fought outside the giant wall for many years and encountered all kinds of monsters and dangers. She had relied on the counterattack effect of the dragon blood technique. Phew! Dean exhaled lightly. This time, he didn't persist to the limit of 10 minutes. He changed his heartbeat ahead of time and returned to the normal elongated breathing method to exercise the heart muscle and maintain body temperature at the same time to avoid exhaustion. According to Aisha, he was currently at the beginning stage. The dragon blood technique was divided into 3 stages. The first was the dragon blood vortex, which was his current stage. It could make the blood circulate in the body like a vortex with the heart as the core. This could stimulate the body's potential. Even if the strength was overdrawn, he could still recover to his peak state and continue fighting. However, if it was used for a long time, there would be sequelae and early life. Dean had thought about this for a long time. Although Aisha couldn't tell the reason for the exhaustion of vitality, but he knew that stimulating the blood to restore the body's function was only to accelerate the cell division. Everyone's cell division was limited. When the cell stopped dividing, it was the end of life. So how long a person could live depended on the toughness of the last cell division. The second stage of the dragon blood technique was beast blood boiling. It stimulated the blood of the whole body to collide with each other. In a short time, the oxygen and energy in the blood would be released greatly, and the body would enter the state of rage. It could greatly increase strength. When the blood collided with each other, the blood vessels would swell and oppress the pain nerve. It would lead to a temporary loss of pain, and the body would become a tyrant in human form. The third stage of the dragon blood technique was the dragon blood tide. Aisha had only briefly mentioned it to Dean, but didn't elaborate on it because even she herself hadn't reached this stage. The ice here is showing signs of melting. Aisha looked at the surrounding ice cave. Her eyes flickered with a hint of tenderness. She said softly, "It's time for us to leave." Dean glanced at her. "Are you ready?" "Yes." Aisha nodded slightly. Dean bent down to pick up the armor on the ground. He said, "Let's go. I'll lead the way." Aisha glanced at the 2 bone-biter rats in the corner. After 5 days of growth, the 2 bone-biter rats were nearly half the size of the original. They had been fed the shell and brain of the giant shrimp monster, which made them evolve quickly. Now they could be regarded as 2 rat kings. After 5 days of getting along, the 2 bone-biter rats were no longer afraid of Dean and Aisha. Seeing Aisha looking at them, they immediately squeaked as if to warn her. Dean smiled slightly. Seeing that they didn't kill them, these little things were getting more and more insatiable. He said to Aisha, "Should we roast them and eat them?" Aisha glanced at the 2 bone-biter rats and shook her head slightly. She said, "Forget it. Keep them." "Okay." Dean said to the 2 bone-biter rats, "Little guys, count yourselves lucky." After that, he held the dagger, put the remaining saltpeter, gauze, antidote powder, and other personal items into his backpack. Then he picked up the 2 shadow hunter eggs next to him and swam into the water. Aisha followed him to the entrance of the cave. She suddenly stopped and turned to look at the ice cave. Her eyes flickered slightly. She slowly retracted her gaze and jumped into the water. In the blink of an eye, Dean and Aisha came to the pool in the square and broke out of the water. Dean's wings stretched out from the gap made by the dagger behind the armor. He stood in the air and scanned the surrounding environment. When he didn't see any heat source, he was a little relieved. He knew that from the moment they left the ice cave, it meant that danger would appear at any time. Whoosh! Aisha jumped out of the water. Her feet stepped on the water surface as if she could use it as leverage. She jumped to the square on the shore, wrung her wet hair, and threw it behind her. She said to Dean, "Let's go." Dean nodded, landed, folded his wings, and said to Aisha, "Should we go to the Shadow Hunter's cave first?" "Yes." Aisha nodded. Dean immediately held the 2 eggs and led the way. The 2 Shadow Hunter eggs hadn't moved in the low temperature in the ice cave for 5 days. If they wanted to hatch, they needed to be in the same high-temperature environment as the underground nest. He walked along the street, familiar with the road, toward the mountain where the Shadow Hunter's cave was located. Chapter 573. From the desolate building, Dean found a familiar feeling. He walked along the edge of the street. Skeletons of dead monsters could be seen everywhere on the ground, as well as huge footprints covered with wet moss. In the 300 years of disaster, this soil had been baptized by too many monsters, and it had long been muddy. After walking for 4 or 5 miles, Aisha suddenly said, "Change the road. There are monsters ahead." "Okay." Dean immediately changed the route. Although Aisha's wounds had only healed and her strength had not yet recovered, the perception ability of her body organs was not something he could match. After taking a long detour, the 2 continued to move forward. Along the way, with Aisha's reminder, Dean did not encounter any dangerous high-level monsters. As for some dense ordinary undeads and small monsters, he could kill them easily, and there was no need to hide. Half an hour later, the 2 came to the Shadow Hunter's cave. "Someone has been here?" Dean's face changed slightly when he saw the footprints left in front of the cave. He stepped forward and carefully examined it. He found that the number of footprints was messy. From the depth of the footprints, there were a total of 7 people. This was the number of people in the Dragon Guard squad. "It's the footprints of the Dragon Guard." Aisha glanced at it and looked into the cave, saying, "It's probably the exploration team that came with me to find the Wing Clan's Parna. They found this place and asked the Dragon Guard to transplant the eggs inside. Let's go in and have a look." "The Dragon Guard?" Dean was surprised. "How do you know?" "I recognize the lines on the soles of the boots," Aisha said and walked into the cave. Dean woke up. He didn't expect that the lines on the soles of the boots could also be her means of identification. He felt that he had learned another trick. After entering the cave, Dean noticed that the footprints led to the depths of the cave. He couldn't help but feel a little regretful. He thought he could steal a few more eggs for collection, but now it seemed that they had all been handed over. This time, with so many legendary monsters' eggs, the Dragon Clan should be able to cultivate a lot of strong people, right? Dean said. It should not be the first time something like this has happened in the wasteland for so many years. So, the Dragon Clan's pioneers all have legendary magic marks? Aisha shook her head slightly and said, the reason why legendary magic marks are called legendary magic marks is that the number of people with legendary magic marks is extremely small. It doesn't mean that one can get legendary magic marks by getting legendary parasitic soul worm. What do you mean? Dean was puzzled. The absorption of the legendary parasitic soul worm is different from that of other parasitic soul worms. The host can easily be devoured by the parasitic soul worm and become an insect man. Aisha turned to look at him. You live outside the giant wall, so your information is limited. The highest level outside the giant wall is hunter level. So you don't know that there are conditions for magic marks replacement. Not everyone can replace magic marks. Dean was startled. He suddenly remembered the time when he absorbed the Splitter's parasitic soul worm. At that time, the parasitic soul worm drilled into his body and desperately drilled into his head. Fortunately, he pinched his neck so that the Splitter's parasitic soul worm couldn't find a place to rest. Only then did it reside in the magic mark nest on his chest. It seemed that if it had drilled into his brain at that time, he would have most likely become the insect man that Aisha had mentioned. Although he didn't know what the bugmen looked like, just the name alone made him feel nauseous. There are conditions for magic mark replacement? Dean looked at her with a hint of asking for advice. He knew that the information in this world was blocked by layers of barriers. It was difficult to get complete information with his previous identity, and even false information. Yes, Aisha said. You also know that the higher the physique, the more parts of the body will transform. This is caused by the magic marks. If you rashly replace the magic marks when there are too many beastified parts, then it will be very difficult for the body that has already been transformed to accept the transformation of the new magic marks. It may even conflict with each other and cause unpredictable consequences. The most serious possibility is death. And if you are a little bit lucky, your consciousness will collapse, your body will swell, and you will become a strange and ugly inhuman bloodthirsty monster. So, if the physique is too high, the magic marks will be fixed and can't be replaced. Aisha turned to look at Dean and said, You are very lucky to get legendary magic marks at the hunter stage. Generally speaking, even if you evolve to the senior hunter stage, the risk of magic mark replacement is only about 20%. Unless you are very unlucky, most people will be fine. Dean was startled. So, even if we get a lot of these shadow hunter eggs, we can only give them to the potential newcomers in the family. As for those who have already become frontiersmen and pioneer, their magic marks have been fixed, so they can't use them. Aisha said, and the problem is here. Although the resistance of the magic marks is less when replacing the new hunter with the legendary magic marks, so there won't be any danger, the legendary parasitic soul worm itself is very dangerous. It can't be subdued by ordinary hunters. Even the elite hunters specially cultivated by our dragon family with extraordinary willpower will be eroded by the legendary parasitic soul worm and become an insect man. So, even if we get dozens of legendary insect eggs this time, it will be good if only 1/10 of them can become legendary magic mark. And among the people branded with legendary magic marks, there are very few who can live to the pioneer level. Dean was secretly surprised. He didn't expect that absorbing the legendary magic marks was so dangerous. Even the elite hunters specially cultivated by the dragon family had such a high failure rate. If it was an ordinary person, wouldn't the legendary parasitic soul worm become a poison? If it becomes an insect man, what will happen? Dean asked. Aisha narrowed her eyes slightly and said, "It will be dealt with." Dudian knew that it was true. Aisha slowed down a little and walked side by side with Dean. She looked at him and said, "I see that you have a lot of scars on your body. Have you experienced a lot of hardships before?" Dean suddenly thought of the things in the prison. His eyes flashed slightly and said, "It's okay. It's all over. But according to what you said, I really have to thank these hardships for tempering my willpower. Otherwise, I would have died when I got the splitter parasitic soul worm. When we experience pain, we hate the pain. When the pain is over, we thank the pain," Aisha said slowly. Dean looked at her and nodded slightly. "Yes. Here we are." Aisha walked briskly and came to the collapsed cave in front of the hole in the ground. She looked inside and said, "Sure enough, it's all gone. Only the traces of the egg pit are left." Dean squatted and looked at the hole. Indeed, as Aisha said, the original hot nest was empty, and the once dense eggs were all gone. "They have probably been moved to the stronghold." Aisha retracted her gaze and looked at Dean. "Unfortunately, you are already a frontiersman. Otherwise, with your willpower, you can definitely replace the magic mark with the Shadow Hunter magic mark. You can also further deify the magic mark and make it a legendary deified magic mark. Your future potential will reach the point where it is second only to me. In this case, I will recommend you to the family. You will definitely get a lot of resources." Speaking of this, there was a trace of a sigh in her eyes. Dean's heart moved. "You have a legendary deified magic mark?" He almost said the word also. Aisha grunted. "My magic mark has been prepared since I was born. It is the third of the 8 legendary monsters, the Dragon Warrior. This is the legendary monster that our Dragon Clan's ancestors once subdued. It is also the magic mark passed down from generation to generation in our Dragon Clan." Dean was stunned. "Passed down from generation to generation? Doesn't this mean that the Dragon Clan has a lot of parasitic soul worms of the Dragon Warrior? Does it mean that the Dragon Clan has a lot of parasitic soul worms?" However, what surprised him even more was that legendary monsters actually have a ranking. Seeing Dean's expression, Aisha seemed to know what he was thinking. She smiled and said, "All the creatures in this world have strong and weak ones, even the same type of monster. Legendary monsters are no exception. Like this Shadow Hunter, it is ranked 7th among the 8 legendary monsters. Although its stealth ability is first class, if its camouflage ability is seen through, its frontal ability is only slightly stronger than rare monsters." "What about the Splitter?" Dean asked. Aisha smiled and said, "The Splitter is an extreme attack type monster. It is ranked 4th. It is a very rare legendary monster." Dean was slightly startled. He was a little lost in his heart, but thinking that it was not at the bottom, he was somewhat comforted. He suddenly thought of something and couldn't help but ask, "Wing Clan and Rock Clan, are they the same as you? They have legendary magic marks passed down from generation to generation. Are their legendary magic marks ranked 1st and 2nd? "Of course not." Aisha smiled and said, "It is true that there are legendary magic marks passed down from generation to generation. Otherwise, once the generations are cut off, it is equivalent to destruction. However, their legendary magic marks are far from comparable to our Dragon Clan. The legendary magic mark passed down from generation to generation in the Wing Clan is the Bat Whisperer, which is ranked 5th. That's why we call them the evangelists of the Wall Lord's ears. They always like to snitch in front of the Wall Lord. The legendary magic mark of the Rock Clan is ranked 6th, which is above the Shadow Hunter. So, your Splitter magic mark is better than the magic marks of the Wing Clan and the Rock Clan. But their magic marks are deified. Under the stimulation of deification, it is enough to make up for the gap of 1 or 2 rank. Especially the magic marks below the top 3, the gap is not big." Dean was startled. He didn't expect that the magic mark of the splitter he accidentally got was better than the magic mark of 2 of the 3 families in the inner wall. This meant that his growth potential could surpass them. If combined with the new divine ability, even if they had the bloodline power, it was enough to wipe out or even surpass them. However, this kind of ranking is not absolute, Aisha said. Every legendary monster has its best field, terrain, and environment. They won't easily leave the environment they are good at. Once other legendary monsters enter the environment they are good at, they will inevitably fall into a disadvantageous position or even be killed. Sometimes, even the Shadow Hunter, which is ranked 7th, can kill the Splitter and the Bat Whisperer. However, this kind of actual ranking that is affected by other factors doesn't have much impact on the top 3 legendary monsters. Aisha whispered. Although they are known as the 8 legendary monsters, the gap between the top 3 legendary monsters is getting bigger and bigger. Especially the first legendary monster, Dream Breeder, which is almost beyond the scope of legendary monsters. No matter what environment it is in, it can easily kill other legendary monsters. Even Legendary Hunter may be killed by it. So strong? Dean was surprised. Aisha nodded slightly. This is what I heard from Grandmother Dragon Mother. I haven't seen it with my own eyes. The trace of Dream Breeder hasn't appeared for hundreds of years. The most recent appearance was also 100 years ago. At that time, only footprints were left. The saintess of that generation couldn't find it, so it was left unsettled. But it is certain that no one has the magic mark of Dream Breeder, so we can just take it as a legend and listen to it. Dean's eyes flashed slightly. There was some desire in his heart, the desire for power. However, as Aisha said, it was fine to listen to it as a story. Not to mention the Dream Breeder, even other legendary monsters were rare. Let's find a place to rest, Aisha said. Dean nodded. The two went out of the cave. Dean found the place where Ruby hid the bag, but he didn't see the bag. Instead, there were a few footprints in front of the cave. Obviously, the bag of food was taken away by those dragon guards. He smiled bitterly and took Aisha to the desolate neighborhood. They found a relatively dilapidated building and went in. They spread branches and vines on the ground as a bed. Now that Aisha's strength had not recovered, she could only continue to live in this orange wasteland. In the following days, Dean and Aisha went out to hunt together every day. With Aisha's super perception, the two didn't encounter any high-level monsters. However, this was also related to the range and time of each hunting. They didn't hunt in a large area, and each time they went out for a short time. After hunting the small monsters, they quickly returned to their hiding place. After eating and drinking in the residence, Dean exercised his heart muscle. Aisha had nothing to do, so she taught Dean a complete set of Dragon Thorn, which was the secret skill that Dean had previously been accused of stealing. In Aisha's words, teaching Dragon Blood technique had already violated the rules, so it didn't matter to do it one more time. Time flew. In the blink of an eye, Dean and Aisha had lived in the Orange Wasteland for more than half a month, which didn't include the unknown time they lived in the ice cave. Have you packed everything? Aisha stood outside the gate of the dilapidated ruins with only the blood-red sword on her back. She turned her head and looked at Dean, who was packing inside. But soon, he remembered that the girl in his arms had saved his life several times. This kindness was difficult to repay. The distracting thoughts in his mind immediately cooled down, and he felt a trace of shame. He shifted his line of sight to another place, and he was surprised to find that the desolate street below him was like a blurry afterimage that flashed by quickly. If he was running on the ground at such a speed, it would simply be unheard of. Is this her real strength? Dean's eyes moved to Aisha's face, but her expression was very calm. Aisha looked forward, holding Dean with one hand to prevent him from falling. At the same time, there was a trace of nervousness in her heart. Since Dean hugged her, The picture of them hugging each other in the dark ice cave suddenly appeared in her mind. This picture lingered in her mind and repeatedly appeared. She felt her cheeks were hot, and there was a feeling of redness, but thinking that Dean would notice her abnormality, she immediately controlled her heart to change the blood flow, reducing the blood flow in her face, so that her expression remained calm. At this time, she noticed that Dean was looking up at her. Her heart tightened, and she pretended to casually bow her head, saying, "Is there any discomfort?" Dean saw her looking at him, and his expression and tone were extremely calm. Suddenly, he felt an inexplicable sense of loss in his heart. A self-deprecating thought emerged in his mind. Dean, you are really too dirty. I have no reaction to a girl, and you actually think of some messy and unrealistic things. Thinking of this, his expression returned to calmness, and he shook his head. Nothing. Aisha noticed the change in Dean's expression, and a trace of doubt flashed in her eyes. But she did not ask, and could only be silent. Whoosh, whoosh. The whistling sound of the wind brushed past their ears. Along the way, the two of them flew in silence. Desolate streets, mountains, suburban swamps, and other ground scenery passed quickly under their feet, like a fleeting phantom. Only the gray clouds in the sky were always lingering, as if there was no end. We are entering the red wasteland. After flying for half an hour, Aisha said. Dean woke up from the silence and looked forward. His eyes could not help but reveal a trace of surprise. Although he had heard from Ian and others that the terrain of the red wasteland and the orange wasteland did not change much, he could feel the gap in the middle at this moment. In the orange wasteland, they could still vaguely see the outline of the dilapidated old buildings on the ground, including the streets and gravel. It could still be seen that this was a ruined city. However, a few thousand meters ahead, there were a few craters that were dozens of meters in diameter on the ground. They looked like deep craters caused by meteorites. The surroundings were full of rubble, but there was no sign of any buildings. All the ruined buildings had been razed to the ground. Whoosh! Bloody dragon wings swept across the sky. Aisha and Dean quickly flew to this messy area. Dean suddenly saw that in front of this messy area, the ground was even more dilapidated. There were deep pits and cracks everywhere. There were few huge trees and dense vines on the ground. Obviously, something had passed through here for a long time. This was still a ruined city, but there was no shadow of the city. Only from the broken stones piled up, a little bit of the location of the former buildings could be seen. Aisha looked down in front of her, and there was a trace of seriousness in her eyes. After they entered the red wasteland for more than 10 minutes, suddenly, from the ground, a shadow jumped out of the gravel gap, just in front of them, as if it had calculated Aisha's flying speed. Roar! Chapter 575. Six-Eyed Spider. Dean was startled by the monster that suddenly jumped up. After seeing its appearance, his face suddenly changed. This was a level 65 monster. Looking at its size, it had obviously reached the mature stage. Aisha's eyes were slightly cold. She suddenly threw the dagger backhandedly. Whoosh! The hilt of the dagger was facing outwards, and its speed was extremely fast. It directly collided with the green spider web that the six-eyed magic spider had spat out. In the next moment, the green spider web suddenly fell down and actually pounced towards the six-eyed magic spider. The giant mouth on the back of the six-eyed spider issued a sharp cry. Its body suddenly turned sideways. It wanted to dodge, but its speed was too slow. It was immediately covered by the green spider web, and even the dagger hit its back. Aisha's body suddenly sank. She raised her leg high and lashed down like an angry whip. Bang! The head of the six-eyed spider was flung by the leg. Its skull suddenly caved in, and it fell straight down like a meteorite. With a bang, it fiercely smashed into the gravel on the ground, raising countless dust clouds. Aisha glanced at it. She didn't stop, nor did she have the thought of picking up the dagger. She continued to fly forward. Dean was shocked. He didn't expect that a level 65 monster would be dealt with by her in the blink of an eye. Although he couldn't see the situation inside because of the dust clouds, he knew that falling from a height of 200 or 300 meters, coupled with the strength of Aisha's leg whip, even if it was strong, the bones of the whole body would be broken. This six-eyed spider should be very hungry. That's why it took the risk to hunt for food in the air. Dean thought in his heart. He had read the information about the six-eyed spider in the high-level monster atlas that Ian had given him. It was a kind of amphibious monster. It mainly lived on the ground, but it could also live in the water for several weeks. Moreover, it had a mouth under its abdomen. It could breathe in air at one time, and use it as a propulsion force to soar into the sky. However, the role of this propulsion force was to fly. It was very slow to change the direction freely. That's why he didn't dodge in time when he was reflected by the spiderweb. Dean couldn't help but admire Aisha. She was able to think of such a method in a flash. She used the blunt dagger handle to hit the resilient cobweb and drove the cobweb to counterattack, giving her a taste of her own medicine. Apart from pure strength, the gap between me and her in combat experience and adaptability is too big, Dean secretly thought. He secretly decided that he had to seize the time to practice his fighting skills while making the new invention. Although he could rely on the new invention to protect himself, but to defeat the top powerhouses of the inner wall, he still needed his own strength. Whoosh! As he continued to fly, Dean overlooked the scenery of the red wasteland from the sky. The ruins on the ground were everywhere and there were few intact lands. Compared with the ruins of the city in the orange wasteland, this place was completely barren. After 7 or 8 minutes, a boulder was thrown from the ground towards Dean and Aisha. Aisha's eyes flickered. Her dragon wings flapped and her body swayed to avoid the fierce, whistling boulder. Dean looked at the ground and saw a 7 or 8 meters tall gorilla-shaped monster standing in the ruins. Its body was covered with thick black hair. There were several curved giant horns on the top of its head and 2 arms on its back. It was the Herculean ape, a level 62 existence. Whoosh! The dragon wings crossed the sky and flew straight forward. In the blink of an eye, the Herculean ape was left behind until it disappeared. Dean felt cold sweat oozing from his forehead. If he had flown before, it would have been difficult for him to react and avoid the boulder. As Aisha said before, flying in the red wasteland was indeed an extremely dangerous thing. He turned his eyes slightly and suggested to Aisha, "Should we fly a little higher to avoid being attacked by these land monsters?" Aisha looked up at the dark sky and said, "It's more dangerous up there." "More dangerous?" "Above the clouds is the place where the thunderbirds rest," Aisha said slowly. "Thunderbirds usually live in groups. Even I can only avoid them if I attract their attention." Dean was startled. He couldn't help but look up at the gray clouds above his head. He felt a chill in his heart. The wilderness outside the giant wall was really full of danger. Whoosh! The wind whistled as Aisha vigorously flapped her dragon wings and flew straight forward. Half an hour later, Aisha whispered, "In front of us is the edge of the red wasteland number 1. The place closest to the black wasteland is also the base camp of our dragon clan in the wasteland." Dean followed her gaze. The desolate black soil in his sight was getting closer. Soon, he saw a fortress similar to an ancient city. It was surrounded by a high ring-shaped wall, about 100 meters high. There were several observation towers and residential buildings inside the wall. "This is the stronghold of the Dragon Clan." Whoosh! Aisha's figure obscured the light and flew at a high speed. In the blink of an eye, she came to the sky above the fortress and landed like a horrible shadow. Soldiers wearing strange armors were stationed around the high walls of the fortress. The armors were engraved with dragon patterns. Most of them were the dragon guards. Saintess? Several guards were surprised to see Aisha. They quickly stepped forward and bowed. "Greetings, Saintess." The news that Aisha's Saintess status had been removed hadn't spread to the wasteland yet. Therefore, they still called Aisha as Saintess. Where are the 8 generals? Aisha put away her dragon wings and her expression became indifferent. Seeing this, Dean immediately withdrew his hand from her waist and quietly stood beside her. Aisha's eyes moved and looked at Dean. There was a trace of softness in her eyes. But when she looked at the attendants in front of her, her indifference was restored. Saintess, which 8 generals are you looking for? A servant courageously asked. Aisha narrowed her eyes and didn't say anything. She turned around and walked to the edge of the fortress. She stepped forward and stepped on the air. Her body fell straight down. Her knees slightly bent as she landed. She immediately dissolved the downward force and landed smoothly. Only 2 deep footprints were left on the ground. She stepped forward. Dean followed her and jumped down from the fortress, but he didn't land as naturally as her. His feet stepped on the fortress to cushion the impact, and then he did a somersault in the air to resolve the impact. Saintess! Greetings, Saintess! The soldiers saw Aisha and quickly bowed their heads to salute. At the same time, they secretly looked at Dean, who was behind Aisha. When they saw the standard armor on Dean's body, there was a trace of understanding in their hearts. Chapter 576. All of them are at the limitless level. Dean observed the heat source reaction of these soldiers through thermal vision. The result surprised him. He didn't expect these seemingly ordinary soldiers to have such strong strength. Could it be that the most ordinary existence here was the Dragon Guard? After Aisha passed by, the soldiers raised their heads and saw Dean looking at them. They slightly raised their heads and grinned at him. There was a playful smile on their lips, with a bit of provocation and contempt. Dean's expression was as usual. His eyes swept over their faces without the slightest change. Aisha walked along the street, passing by buildings along the way. When passing by one of the buildings, Dean immediately heard bursts of women's sobbing and some men's laughter coming from the building. He turned his head and looked. Using thermal vision, he saw that there were a lot of heat sources in this building. Some of them were weak. They seemed to be ordinary primary hunters. Judging from their figures, they seemed to be women. What's this? Dean retracted his gaze and asked Aisha in confusion. Aisha looked at him and squinted. Are you also interested? Dean was startled and coughed lightly. How come? I just want to ask, how can there be such a place here? Aisha deeply looked at him, and her expression returned to normal. She looked straight at the road ahead and said, The Dragon Guard has been living in the wasteland for a long time, far away from home and the protection of the giant wall. They live a precarious life. If there is no entertainment, they will go crazy. Dean's eyes moved slightly. He suddenly thought of the things in the Thornflower prison. When people were imprisoned in the cage, they would be abnormal. If the giant wall was a cage, then these people who lived outside the wall should be free and happy. But the reality was not like this. If the caged birds escaped from the cage, they would perish. What was the real cage? Dean's thoughts slowly drifted away. He couldn't see the buildings on both sides of the street until a voice came from the front. Your Highness Saintess, you are finally back. We were worried to death. The one who spoke was a young male voice. Dean looked up and saw a handsome young man standing in front of Aisha. He was tall and thin with bright blonde hair. He was wearing a soft white robe and had an elegant temperament. The only flaw was that there was a long and narrow scar on his cheek. It was like a crack on a fine porcelain. It was a pity. How long have I been gone? Aisha asked. The handsome young man was slightly surprised and immediately said, It has been more than 40 days since I left last time. Dean was surprised. The last time Aisha left was to kill Parna in the Orange Wasteland, and then she met him. So they had been together for more than a month, and he had also been in the wasteland for more than a month. Aisha narrowed her eyes and said in her heart, It's been so long. Her ceremony should be over. She quickly took back her thoughts and thought of something. She turned to Dean and said, This is Eureka, one of the 8 generals. He is also my friend. Eureka, this is my friend Dean. I hope you can take care of him in the future. There was a flash of surprise in Eureka's eyes. He noticed Dean behind Aisha when she came from afar. He thought he was just a victim Aisha picked up when she went to the Orange Wasteland. He didn't expect him to be her friend. He had been in the wasteland for so many years and knew Aisha's character very well. Although this girl was very strong, her EQ was very average. She had always been a loner, didn't like to talk much, and didn't like to go to crowded places, so she had very few friends. He didn't expect that this little dragon guard could be a friend of a dignified saintess. It was incredible. He looked up and down at Dean, but still couldn't see anything special about him. He was too mediocre. However, since he could become friends with Aisha, he must have some hidden extraordinary ability or some special reasons. Thinking of this, a smile appeared on his face. He stretched out his hand and said, "Hello, nice to meet you. If there's anything I can help you in the future, don't hesitate to ask me." Dean nodded slightly and shook hands with him. A friend of a friend was not necessarily a friend. He only recognized Aisha here. Seeing Dean was serious, Eureka raised his eyebrows slightly. He suddenly understood that this person's character seemed to be not much different from Aisha's. They were both taciturn guys. It could be said that birds of a feather flock together. "Are you the only one in the fortress? Where are the others?" Aisha asked. Eureka smiled and said, "Amy and Gabby are out on a mission. The others are also busy with their own things. I'm a little free, so I came to find you." Aisha frowned slightly and said, "Has the fortress been attacked during this time?" "Twice. It was a little guy who sneaked in, and we killed him." Eureka glanced at her and said, "What about you? You've been back for so long. Did you encounter something difficult? You went out last time to kill the Wing Clan invaders who smuggled in. With the skills of the Wing Clan, even their holy son may not be your opponent. Did you encounter a monster?" Aisha nodded slightly. "I met a legendary hunter." "Legendary hunter?" Eureka was surprised and couldn't help but ask, "What happened? Are you all right?" "I'm fine." Aisha shook her head slightly. "I was injured. I'm recuperating outside." Then she walked forward. In front of her was a castle with hundreds of steps. It was extremely tall and majestic. Eureka immediately followed and said, "Are you all right? I'll find someone to treat you right away." "I've recovered." "Let's see it again. It's not good if there are any sequelae." "Okay. Well, I'll call the doctor right away." Eureka immediately turned and ran. When he passed by Dean, he glanced at him and nodded slightly. Dean also nodded slightly. After Eureka left, he frowned slightly. He always felt that Eureka was a bit unpleasant to the eye. Aisha didn't look back, but seemed to notice Dean's expression and said, "What's wrong?" Dean's eyebrows loosened and he shook his head. "Nothing." A glimmer of light flashed in Aisha's eyes. She smiled faintly and said, "You don't seem very happy." "No." Dean immediately denied and changed the topic. "There should be a lot of monsters at the border of the Red Wasteland. Isn't it easy to be attacked by monsters when building such a big target as the fortress?" Chapter 577. When he came to the majestic fortress, Dean saw that there was no one inside. It was extraordinarily quiet. There was not a single maid or squire. The tall pillars supported the entire dome of the fortress. The cold wind poured in from the outside of the pillars, howling as if it was wailing. "This is where you live?" Dean was a little stunned. He could vaguely see the beds, weapon racks for hanging swords, and the training field. But apart from that, there was no decoration. It was cold and lonely. Aisha didn't deny or admit it. She turned to Dean and said, "I will apply to the clan to make a magic weapon for you, but I need to extract part of the magic mark in your body. The medical equipment here is relatively backward. It may take some time to prepare. You should rest for 2 days and prepare for the operation." "Okay." Dean nodded and glanced at her thin figure. He whispered, "When my magic weapon is made, I will help you." Aisha was startled. Her eyes softened a lot. She whispered, "Okay." As if it was an agreement, the cold wind swept past them, bringing a trace of warmth. After a long time, Eureka ran up the step. When he saw the two people in the training field, his eyes flickered slightly. He immediately rushed over and said to Aisha, "Your Royal Highness, the doctor is here." Aisha turned her head and her eyes fell on the steps behind him. A graceful figure jumped up from there. She was wearing a white coat and slender silver alloy high-heeled boot. Her snow-white legs were covered with black stockings that extended to the depths of her skirt. She was dressed very coldly and wore a pair of black thick-rimmed glasses. She walked over step by step. "Your Royal Highness, you are finally back," the woman said to Aisha with a faint expression. Aisha smiled. "Fanny, you are here?" "It's because of you," Fanny said indifferently. "I don't know where you disappeared these days. There were heavy casualties here. The clan had to send me to the front line." What 8 generals? They are more like 8 wastes." Eureka looked embarrassed and said, "Fanny, we can't deal with monsters of that level at all. It's good that we can resist them." Fanny glanced at him. "Don't find excuses for wastes." Eureka paused and smiled bitterly. Dean stopped his exercise and turned to look at the woman curiously. There was a trace of surprise in his heart. This kind of tone and attitude was a bit like the venomous tongue he had when he first met Aisha. Aisha frowned. "Does the clan know about me? Isn't that obvious?" Fanny shrugged and said, "You're our holy maiden. You've been missing for so long, and those old geezers in our family are already worried sick. Look, the family has already sent that good little sister of yours here. Didn't you see her?" Aisha and Dean were startled. Dean's pupils shrank. "Was Hathaway here?" Aisha turned her head and said to Eureka, "My sister is here too? Why didn't you tell me before?" Eureka said, "Your Highness, you just came back. I was going to report to you later." Aisha's face was gloomy as she remained silent. Fanny replied in an indifferent manner, "What difference does it make whether I say it or not? Are you scared of her?" Aisha frowned and said, "It's not as simple as you think." Dean glanced at her and knew that she was worried about him. If Hathaway also came to the fortress, she would inevitably find trouble with him. Now he was walking into a trap. He immediately said, "How about I leave here?" Hearing his words, Fanny's eyes moved and fell on Dean. A trace of surprise flashed in her eyes. She looked up and down, frowned, and said to Aisha, "This kid is—" "My friend," Aisha said. Fanny narrowed her eyes and turned to look at Dean and said, "Dragonguard? Kid, you're the one who caused little Lisa to lose her holy maiden status. I didn't expect you to have the face to appear here." Dean's face changed slightly. "Fanny!" Aisha was slightly angry. Fanny was slightly startled. She didn't expect that Aisha would be angry with her, and it was because of someone else. She couldn't help but look at Dean again, and her brows slowly wrinkled, and said, "Are you worried that your sister will use him to deal with you? How do you know that this kid isn't your sister's man? Maybe he has been colluding with your sister for a long time. Even if you can be sure that he isn't your sister's man, you should also understand that anyone who gets close to you will become a disaster for you." Aisha bit her lip and said, "Don't say any more. He has nothing to do with Hathaway." Dean wanted to leave, but after hearing her last sentence, he couldn't help but clench his fists and look up at her. Fanny noticed Dean's gaze and snorted coldly and said, "What? You're not convinced? If you are really little Lisa's friend, you'd better leave her immediately. Otherwise, you will harm her. Do you know how powerful her sister is? If you want to die, no one will care about you, but don't involve little Lisa." "Shut up." Aisha glared at her and said, "Don't say any more." Fanny was startled, and gritted her teeth and said, "If you want to protect him, then let him leave you or you will regret it. I have a sense of propriety in this matter." Aisha took a deep breath and said, "This is my territory. No one can hurt my people." Fanny looked at her deeply and said, You're on your own. I didn't come here today to quarrel with you. You took so long to come back, so you should be injured. Let me give you a diagnosis first. Aisha glanced at her and nodded slightly. Fanny glanced at Eureka and Dean next to her and said, Do you two gentlemen know to give way? Eureka smiled bitterly and said, Okay, I'll go now. Aisha said to Dean, You go with Eureka. He will arrange a residence for you. Here, Hathaway won't dare to touch you otherwise. I won't let her leave alive. Fanny and Eureka were startled. Both of them looked at Aisha incredulously. They never thought that she would go to this point for this boy. Hathaway had offended and hurt her countless times, and she had endured it all. She didn't fight back even once. But this time she was willing to kill her sister for this boy? Both of them suddenly found that they had greatly underestimated this boy's position in Aisha's heart. Dean looked at Aisha in a daze, and an indescribable complex feeling suddenly welled up in his heart. He was a little surprised, a little shocked, and a little scared. He slightly clenched his fists and nodded and said, I won't let her use me again. Chapter 578. Have you forgotten the lesson from before? Fanny said to Aisha after Dudian left, Your sister isn't like others. She knows how to be grateful. What she wants is not just an identity, but absolute power. As long as you exist, you will be her enemy and her obstacle. She won't be soft-hearted. Sooner or later, it will be a problem if you keep him by your side. Aisha turned to the bedside and sat down. If I let him go, where can he go? Fanny was startled. If he goes back to the wall, it will be more dangerous for him to be alone. Aisha said, Many people in the family have pledged allegiance to Hathaway, and they are worried about the opportunity to make meritorious contributions. He is an orphan and has no one to rely on. He has been homeless for a long time. Only here, he has a glimmer of hope for survival. Orphan? Fanny was slightly taken aback. She then looked at her and fell silent. After a long while she said, He has no background, no power, and nothing at all. He can only blame himself for coming into contact with a world that he doesn't deserve to come into contact with. A person like him can only live in the mud. That's where he belongs. You shouldn't have forced him out. Even though he'll be able to breathe fresh air, the price is his life. If he's here, I can protect him. Aisha tilted her head and looked at her. Moreover, don't underestimate him. If you were him, you might not be able to reach the point he is today. Moreover, he has legendary magic marks. Legendary magic marks? Fanny was shocked. This kid has legendary magic marks. Aisha smiled. Isn't it amazing? As far as I know, this kid is from the outer wall. He is an orphan and has no one to rely on. How could he have legendary magic marks? Fanny was shocked. Even if he was lucky enough to get legendary parasitic soul worm, but without professional training, how could he withstand the erosion of legendary parasitic soul worm? So, don't underestimate him. Aisha smiled. I believe that one day he will soar above the real sky. Fanny stared at her blankly for a long time before she slowly came back to her senses. The shock on her face had also gradually subsided. She shook her head slightly and said, Even a legendary magic mark is futile. If your sister finds out, he will definitely die. Not to mention that he hasn't grown up yet. Even if he did, he would only be an excellent legendary pioneer. But there are plenty of such people in our family. Besides, he doesn't have the bloodline power or the secret skills that he has learned since he was young. Compared with other legendary pioneers in our family who have been practicing secret skills since they were young, he is much weaker. Aisha smiled and shook her head. She didn't say anything. She didn't tell Fanny that Dean had learned the first stage of the extremely difficult dragon blood technique in less than half a month. One must know that even she, who was hailed as a rare genius in 100 years, had spent an entire month to master the first stage. The difference is too great. Fanny sighed and said, It's a pity. If he hadn't been related to you, he could have become a character. But your status is too high. You and him are like a bird and a fish. Even if he has transformed, he is still a fish after all. At most, he can dominate the deep water, but he can't leap into the sky. Aisha said softly, "If so, then I am willing to land in the water." Fanny was stunned and looked at her blankly. "This is your residence." Eureka took Dean to a manor. He raised his hand and pointed at one of the buildings, saying, "You live here. This is my manor. Her Highness Hathaway's people won't dare to break in." "Thank you." Dean nodded. Eureka sighed and patted Dean's shoulder. "As a friend of Her Highness Aisha, I advise you to leave her. Otherwise, you will bring disaster to her." Dean was silent for a moment and shook his head. "I can't leave." Eureka was startled and frowned. "Her Highness Aisha's status is too different from yours. Although she treats you as a friend, there are many things that you can't control. In this world, many people think that they can do whatever they want, but the fact is that you have to do what others want you to do. Otherwise, you can't survive." "I know." Dean looked calm and said, "But I can't leave anymore." "What do you mean?" Eureka looked sullen. Dean looked straight at him and said, "You shouldn't delay the news. Now Hathaway should have known about me. If I leave at this time, she will definitely send someone to follow me, assassinate me, or capture me as a hostage. So, I can't leave anymore, understand?" Eureka was startled. His face changed for a moment and finally sighed, "Go to rest." Then he turned and left. Dean looked at his back and was silent for a moment. Then he turned and walked toward the pointed building. "I have to find a way to leave secretly. They are right. If I stay here, I will be a burden," he thought in his heart. Although he didn't want to admit it, he had to admit that he was too weak now. When he came to the pointed building, several attendants inside had already been ordered to salute Dean. These attendants and maids were all hunters and served as servants here to serve the pioneers. Although he was a little depressed, he had to live a normal life. Dean changed and washed. After living in the wasteland for more than 40 days, his hair and body had long been smelly. After washing, he had a full meal. While thinking about the way out, he strolled in the pointed building. From the first time he entered the building, he saw that it was full of books. In the library of the outer wall, one needed to be a noble to enter the more famous libraries to borrow books. However, the books in those famous libraries were relatively limited, so he couldn't get too much valuable knowledge and information. But many of the titles of the books here were refreshing. These books should be moved from the Dragon Clan's library for pioneers to read when they were free. After all, if one lived in killing for a long time without other thoughts, it was easy to go crazy. Divine Mechanics, Wing Clan's Air Thorn, Fighting Technique Analysis. Dean's eyes swept through these books. Suddenly, his eyes focused on one of the books. Magic Mark Evolution Law? He raised his hand and pulled it from the bookshelf. His eyes fell on the introduction at the beginning. The evolution of magic marks is like the evolution of monsters and the evolution of magic marks warriors. The body is like a balloon and the power is like air. When the power in the body is full, saturated, and inflated, the body will change accordingly. When the balloon explodes, it is not destruction, but the birth of another form. Hathaway, who he was worried about, seemed to have completely ignored him. She didn't come to trouble him. Moreover, he heard from Eureka that Hathaway and Aisha only met once in these 2 days, and did not say anything. And according to him, when Hathaway saw Aisha, her attitude was very modest. She did not provoke her sister as sharply as before, just like a different person. Hearing Eureka's words, Dean was a bit strange. These days living in the wasteland, he lived with Aisha in the same room. When he was free, he also heard her talk about his relationship with Hathaway and the reason why she used to be modest to her sister. Could it be that Hathaway knew her thoughts and had changed now? So, she did not come to trouble him? Dean had doubts in his heart, but he didn't waste his brain to think about it. In any case, it was always right to prepare for the worst. After all, if he took a wrong step, he would lose his life. He couldn't be too optimistic about things. And according to his understanding of Hathaway, this girl did not only treat Aisha like this because of hatred and jealousy, but also because of her obsession and desire for control. Dean, Her Royal Highness wants to see you. Outside the building, Eureka's voice came. Dean was flipping the book, Basic Fighting Principles, in his hand. Hearing this, he came to the door and saw Eureka waving to him. He immediately walked over and asked, "Is it Aisha?" Chapter 580. Executioner. Dean was stunned. The second-ranked executioner among the legendary monsters? You also know the ranking of the legendary monsters? Eureka was surprised and then smiled. Yes, it's this executioner. We found its traces in the wasteland, and we are sending people to search for it. If we can find its whereabouts, our dragon clan will have hope to have a super strong person with the executioner's magic mark. Dean saw his excitement, and suddenly thought of something. He was a little stunned. From Aisha's mouth, he knew that the top 3 legendary monsters were very different from each other. The first one, the Dream Breeder, could fight against the remaining 7 legendary monsters at the same time, and its strength was extremely strong. Although the Executioner was not as terrible as the Dream Breeder, it could still fight against all the monsters below the top 3, and it could still maintain an undefeated position. Obviously, the Executioner was such a strong legendary monster, and ordinary pioneers could not match it at all. It was like a meal. This also meant that once it was found, he still needed Aisha's help. Thinking of this, a trace of melancholy flashed in his eyes, and he was a little worried. After all, Aisha's injury had just recovered. Although she had recovered most of her strength, it was still very dangerous to meet the Executioner. Her Highness will also go to search in person. The area she is going to is the area where the Executioner left traces, and it is very likely that she will meet the Executioner, so it is not convenient to take you with her. Eureka looked at Dean's worried expression and thought that he was thinking about his own safety, so he patted his shoulder and said, "Don't worry, Her Highness is going to let you go to the area farthest from the Executioner's traces. Also, she asked me to protect you, and there will be no danger." Dean's fingers in his sleeve slightly clenched, and he was silent for a moment and said, "I know, I'll go back and change the armor." "Go quickly." Dean turned back to the building, put on the Dragon Guard armor sent by Eureka, and then filled the bag with food, and carried the bow, quiver, dagger, knife, and other weapons on his back, fully armed. Maybe this is also a chance to leave. Dean thought in his heart. Aisha's lonely figure flashed in his mind, and he suddenly felt a trace of heartache. If at this time he could help her, how good would that be? However, in reality, there was no hero to save the beauty. He was not a hero either. In fact, to him, leaving this place was the best way to help her. Although his heart was aggrieved, his reason eventually prevailed. Dean took a deep breath, gritted his teeth, and quickly left the building. "Let's go." "Yes." The two left Eureka's manor and went straight along the street to the giant castle where Aisha lived. A moment later, the two of them arrived at the giant castle. Aisha stood next to a pillar and looked at the rows of buildings in the fortress. Hearing the wind, she turned around and saw Dean and Eureka, who were fully armed. Her emotionless eyes showed a touch of softness, but it was fleeting. She said, "You're here. Did Eureka tell you everything?" Dean looked at the girl. He had an impulse to stand side by side with her and guard her, but he restrained himself and said, "Everything." Aisha saw a trace of complex look in Dean's eyes, and a slight smile appeared on the corner of her mouth. "Don't worry, I'll be fine. You follow Eureka and he will protect you. After I leave, the fortress is too dangerous. When I finish my business, I'll go find you." The sun was setting, and the dim yellow light shone on her cheeks from the pillar. Her hair fluttered in the breeze and twined around her cheek. She gently swept her hand over it and pulled it to her ear. Her tone was very soft. Dean stared at her blankly. The bright red sunset reflected in his eyes like two groups of wine-red flames. He suddenly felt that this girl was very close to him, but also very far away, and he could not touch her. He was too weak, I know. He lowered his head. The sunset shone on his hair, and the shadow covered the upper half of his face. You have to be careful, not only the monsters but also the people around you. Aisha's eyes were soft and she smiled and said, I will. At this time, there was a burst of rapid footsteps outside the giant fortress. Aisha's eyes moved slightly, and she took a deep look at Dean. She said to Eureka, You go first. Yes. Eureka bowed his head and responded. He didn't say a word and turned to leave. Dean glanced at Aisha, and suddenly felt that this seemed to be the last time he saw her. The beautiful figure stood quietly, looking at him so softly. There seemed to be countless stars flashing in her eyes, dreamlike and extremely beautiful. He turned, and the shadow covered his cheeks. He followed behind Eureka, step by step. The air seemed to be quiet. When walking through the steps, the previous rapid footsteps came to him, and then brushed past him. It was a dragon guard who came to report. The next moment, Dean followed Eureka down the steps, and along the street. They were getting farther and farther away from the silent towering giant fortress. East gate of the fortress. Eureka and Dean were like two black lines on the street, flying straight and fast. They saw three figures standing in front of the high wall of the east gate of the fortress, 2 men and 1 woman, all wearing the armor of dragon guards, looking bored. Hearing the wind of Eureka and Dean's arrival, the 3 of them turned their heads. When they got closer and saw Eureka's face, the 3 of them were shocked. Their faces were full of astonishment, but at the same time, there was a hint of unbelievable surprise. General Eureka. The 3 immediately saluted. Eureka and Dean stopped in front of the 3. Eureka glanced at them and nodded. I'll lead the way to explore the number 2 Red Wasteland. Are you ready? Reporting to General, everything is ready, said a young man with gray hair. His cheeks were very handsome, but there was a particularly eye-catching bone spur protruding from the back of his neck. Eureka nodded slightly and introduced him to the 3 of them. This is our new teammate. His name is Dean. Let's go. Hearing his introduction, the 3 glanced at Dean. When they saw that Dean's face was a little too young, they couldn't help but be surprised. They were about to reach out to say hello to Dean, but after hearing Eureka's words, they had to nod to Dean to show politeness, and then followed Eureka to the open east gate. Out of the east gate, Eureka led the way. This time, the traces of the executioner appeared in the number 7 Red Wasteland, which is far away from the number 2 Red Wasteland. Eureka's voice was cold, but don't be careless. Even if we don't meet the executioner, there are other monsters, understand? Chapter 581. Whoosh, whoosh. Outside the fortress, 5 figures were flying at high speed. In the blink of an eye, the steep and towering fortress was far behind them until it disappeared completely. Be careful, Red Wilderness number 1 is in front of us, Eureka said coldly. Dean knew that he was talking to him. After all, the other 3 knew the location of Red Wilderness number 1. He looked up and saw that the ground was covered in black soil. There was no trace of a road, and there were no buildings left. There were piles of rocks everywhere, and 2 to 3 kilometers away, there was a flag that was 4 to 5 meters tall stuck in a pile of rock. The flag was engraved with a black dragon pattern. It fluttered over the wasteland as if it had been burned by flames. The 5 people soon came to the flag. Dean suddenly smelled the strong smell of holy worm powder in the air. This smell with a strange fragrance seeped into his pores. His right arm, which was crystallized under the armor, was faintly throbbing. His eyes slightly narrowed, and he secretly paid attention. Eureka didn't stop. He rushed straight past the flag and saw a huge number written on the other side of the flag. 1. It meant that this was the Red Wilderness #1 entrance. They passed the flag one after another and continued to move forward. In the blink of an eye, they left the border marked by the flag behind. After going 7 or 8 miles into the Red Wilderness, Eureka slowed down and finally stopped. He walked forward and said, "You three, your mission this time is to protect Dean, understand?" Protect Dean? The 3 people were stunned and looked at Dean, who was silently following them. The gray-haired youth could not help but ask, "General, isn't our mission to find the traces of the executioner?" How could it be?" Eureka glanced at him. "Find the executioner? If you really find him, can you go back alive?" The gray-haired youth was stunned. This time, finding the traces of the executioner in the Red Wilderness #1 is secondary. The main thing is to protect Dean. If something happens to him, you and I won't go back alive. Understand? Eureka's eyes were cold as he glanced at the 3 people. The 3 people were stunned. Dean was shocked and could not help but look up at him. Including him? Could it be that Aisha had told him about it before he met her? He suddenly thought of something and came to his senses. He couldn't help but feel touched and ashamed. Aisha was obviously worried about his safety. She sent Eureka to protect him, but at the same time, she was worried that Eureka wouldn't be able to protect him well, so she said harsh words to him. No wonder he had a cold expression on his face along the way. So this was the reason why he was in a bad mood. "General, who is Dean?" The blonde woman among the 3 asked Eureka cautiously. The other 2 also looked at him in bewilderment. No matter how they guessed, they really couldn't figure out why this youth with ordinary strength was so important. Could he be the illegitimate son of the clan leader? However, they had only heard that the Saintess only had a younger sister. How could she have a son? But other than this identity, they really couldn't figure out what kind of noble identity could make a general personally protect him, and it was even more important than the general's life. Eureka glanced at the 3 of them and said, "You'd better not ask what you shouldn't know." The blonde woman lowered her head in embarrassment. Roar. A roar came suddenly. 5 people looked up and saw a giant walking dead nearly 5 meters high behind a pile of stones. This walking dead was similar to human beings in shape, but there was no similarity in organs in all aspects. It had dark mottled skin, white bones protruding from the chest and abdomen, exposed outside the skin, and there were several white bones under the armpits on both sides. The scythe bone outside the arm was very sharp. The head was huge, with a blood-colored eye on the forehead, and the neck was half a meter long. A black blood vessel-like tissue connected the neck and the head, so that the head could bend to any part freely, and even rotate 360 degrees. Giant walking dead. Eureka frowned slightly, took out the dagger from the leggings, and rushed over quickly. When the 3 of them saw the giant walking dead, their faces turned pale, and there was a trace of horror in their eyes. Dean didn't move, standing in the same place, but his heart was secretly awe-inspiring. According to the Atlas of the Wasteland Monsters he had read from the bookshelf of the Pointed Hat Building in the past 2 days, this giant walking dead was a terrible walking dead with a hunting level as high as 58. Unlike monsters, the hunting level of the walking dead was accurate, there was no room for floating up and down, and most of the walking dead could defeat the monsters of the same level. Although the monsters were fierce, they were conscious creatures after all, but the walking dead was different, only instinct, which made its fighting style extremely desperate. Even the monsters did not dare to provoke this kind of prey easily. Whoosh! The giant walking dead and Eureka approached quickly. Eureka's body suddenly flickered, and there were 3 Eurekas in the same place. They surrounded the giant walking dead from 3 angles, and then rushed up together. The giant walking dead looked ferocious, and its dark red eyes turned left and right. It suddenly raised its hand and rushed to one of Eureka's. This rush suddenly failed, and another Eureka disappeared in an instant, leaving only Eureka, who rushed to its back, jumped high, holding a dagger and stabbing it behind the cervical vertebra. This dagger was extremely sharp, and it immediately pierced into the dark red blood vessels on its neck. Eureka walked slowly, as if he was not in a hurry. He looked around and was alert for unknown dangers. After all, even pioneers could die in the barren area, so he had to be careful. Half an hour later, Eureka sat down on a pile of stones and said, "Let's take a break here." The three of them stopped immediately. The blonde woman immediately opened her backpack and took out a bottle of purified water from it. She trotted to Eureka and handed it to him with both hands, saying, "General, here you are." Eureka glanced at her and said indifferently, "No, I have my own." After that, he opened his backpack and took out the purified water from it. The blonde woman withdrew her hand in embarrassment, excused herself, and turned back to the other two. The three of them sat on a pile of stones next to them, taking out dry food and water to replenish their physical strength while guarding around. Dean went directly to Eureka and sat down, so that he could react in time if there was any danger. After resting for more than 10 minutes, Eureka still didn't mean to get up. Instead, he said to the blonde woman and the other two, "We will sleep here tonight. Get ready to sprinkle the Walking Dead powder." The three of them were surprised and looked at each other, but they didn't say anything. They bowed their heads and prepared the defense work of the camp according to his instructions. "It's still early now. Don't you want to walk more?" Dean looked at him in surprise. Eureka shrugged and said, "This mission is to take you out to take refuge, not to hunt monsters. There is no need to walk more. If I were not worried about being caught up by the people sent by Her Highness Hathaway, I would like to camp directly beside the flag in the wasteland." Dean was slightly stunned and thought so he didn't say anything more. Time passed quickly. In a blink of an eye, Dean and others had been in the 2nd District of the Red Wasteland for 3 days. In these 3 days, Eureka took Dean and others to wander in the outer edge of the 2nd District of the Red Wasteland. They did not go deep into the unexplored depth area to avoid encountering monsters to the greatest extent. Nevertheless, in these 3 days, they still encountered several giant Walking Dead, as well as some weaker sickle Walking Dead, and a large number of ordinary Walking Dead, all of which were killed by Eureka and the blonde woman. Dean never made a move from beginning to end. He was closely protected by several people, and he was happy to do so. "I didn't expect that there are so many high-level Walking Dead in the outer edge area that has been cleaned." Eureka frowned slightly, stabbed a dagger, killed a sickle Walking Dead, shook the blood on the dagger, and turned to look around. The blonde woman heard his words, turned her eyes, and said, "General, most of these high-level Walking Dead wandered from the deep area that has not been cleaned, right? Do you need to say that?" Eureka snorted coldly, looked up at the direction of the deep red area in the distance, and frowned slightly. A large number of Walking Dead wandered. Was there something in the deep area that scared them? Thinking of this, his heart was a little gloomy, and he turned and said, "Go back, it's too deep here." The blonde woman and the other two looked at each other. They were still deep here? If they retreated again, they would leave the 2nd District of the Red Wasteland. Although thinking so, the 3 people still obediently followed Eureka and left, sheltering Dean in the middle of the team. Soon, the crowd retreated 4 or 5 miles away. Eureka saw that they had retreated almost and stopped and said, "It's here. Get ready. We will camp here tonight." The blonde woman and the other two had no objection. They immediately circled the ground, set the alarm, and sprinkled Walking Dead powder. Dean sat idly on the pile of stones, glancing around in case of a monster drilling into the ground. Suddenly, he heard a faint wind in his ear. He couldn't help but look at the source of the sound, but saw that it came from a gap in a pile of stones next to him. Dean was surprised. There was wind in the pile of stones? Was there space below? Or this is the wind of the monster breathing? There is movement. Dean immediately said to Eureka, "Under this pile of stones." Eureka, who was sitting on the pile of stones to rest, was slightly surprised. He looked in the direction of Dean's finger and listened. Suddenly, he heard a faint sound of air flow. He could not help but look at it. He pulled out the dagger beside his leg, quietly touched it, and slowly broke the stone. After a while, the pile of stones was broken, and it was dark inside. He threw a few stones into it one after another. He heard a burst of rolling sound, but there was no movement of the monster's counterattack, and the faint sound of air flow was still there. Seeing this, he was relieved, knowing that it was not the breath of the monster, but there was a ventilation below. He broke the stone and continued to walk inside. Anyway, he had come here, and it didn't matter to walk a few more steps. Besides, he was a little curious about where the ventilation below came from. Soon, the pile of stones was broken, revealing a passage, and he walked inside. Dadian immediately caught up with her. The blonde woman and the other two, who were setting up the alarm, saw the action of the two and immediately followed, in case they stayed outside and encountered danger. The 5 people went straight down the passage under the pile of stones. The road was full of gravel, and it was easy to sprain their feet. After more than 50 meters, the gravel disappeared, and a flat road appeared in front of them. The ground was horizontal, as if it was artificially cast. Dean looked up, and suddenly his pupils shrank. He saw more than 20 meters at the end of the road, there was a huge stone door. If it were not for a gap in the middle of the stone door, and the stone pattern on the stone door, he almost thought it was a rock wall. Chapter 583. The 7th District of the Red Wasteland. In the gray and turbid sky, 2 giant wings swept through the sky at a high speed. The figure inlaid in the middle of the giant wings was slender and slender, carrying a giant sword that did not match the body proportion. Every time the wings flapped, the whistling sound of the wind could be heard even on the ground hundreds of meters below. In the high speed forward, Aisha's eyes moved left and right, patrolling around. Despite the high-speed movement, the things on the ground were still presented in her vision. Dynamic vision superimposed heating vision, coupled with high-power vision, her eyes could see every rotten hole on the gravel on the ground. Roar! Roar! Where her figure passed, there were groups of walking dead wandering on the ground. When they heard the movement above their heads, they roared up to the sky, waving their sharp arms and running in the direction of Aisha's flying. Until her figure was lost in the field of vision, they slowly returned to the wandering state. Well! Suddenly, Aisha's eyes narrowed and fell on one of the messy gravel. There were 2 huge footprints on the ground here, and there was a long dent behind the footprints, as if it had been crushed by a giant python. Found it! Aisha's eyes lit up, and she looked forward along the footprints, only to see the footprints spread forward along the gravel to the distance. She immediately flew behind the footprints and chased at a high speed. 10 minutes later, Aisha, who was flying at full speed, suddenly stopped in the air. Her calm face was full of shock, and she looked at a place in front of her in horror. The ground was messy, there were huge craters in the shape of meteorites everywhere, and countless walking dead were lying in the huge craters. The types of these walking dead were strange. There were the most common walking dead, and there were sickle walking dead, one-horned walking dead, giant walking dead, and other high-level walking dead. At this moment, all the bodies were broken, and the heads were almost all destroyed. Only a few walking dead bodies were cut at the waist, and the upper body was still crawling in the pile of corpses, making a clicking sound. However, Aisha's trembling eyes fell on one of the huge craters. There was a huge corpse, or rather, a skeleton, lying there quietly. The flesh on the surface of the corpse had been eaten up, revealing the huge skeleton. At this moment, there were still 7 or 8 walking dead that were cut at the waist, desperately gnawing the remaining flesh. This corpse was an extremely large monster. Just the length of the skeleton from the head to the soles of the feet was about 12 to 13 meters. There was also a 10-meter-long tail that had been gnawed and torn. Its skeleton was extremely ferocious. Other than the spine in the middle, which was extremely thick and strong, The ribs and scaffolding that extended from the spine to the sides were also extremely strong and extended to the left and right. It could be seen that the width of its body was at least 7 or 8 meters. How? Aisha stared at the skeleton. Her heart was shocked. Wasn't this the executioner she was looking for? He was actually dead. She couldn't accept this fact. The executioner's head-on combat ability was not as weak as the shadow hunter. Judging from its size, this executioner had obviously reached the mature stage. This was a legendary monster second only to the Dream Breeder, and it was much stronger than her magic mark demonic dragon. How could it die here? She was stunned for a long time. Suddenly, her eyes noticed a few corpses gnawing on the executioner's body. She was stunned for a moment. The next moment, her eyes swept around again. Looking at the dead corpses all over the place, her pupils slightly shrank. Is it whoosh, whoosh, whoosh? At this moment, 3 huge dragon wings similar to Aisha's came at an extremely fast speed, but their dragon wings were covered with a layer of dark red blood film. They were pure flesh wings, while the back of Aisha's dragon wings were covered with blood-red feathers. Sister. The leading figure made a surprised voice. Hearing this voice, Aisha's contracted pupils suddenly recovered slowly. She put away the shock on her face. She didn't look back, but silently looked at the executioner's body on the ground, showing a thoughtful look. Hathaway took the lead and stopped beside Aisha. She glanced forward and immediately took the purgatory scene below into her eyes. When she saw the giant monster skeleton, she suddenly stared slightly and was shocked. Your Highness Aisha has seen you. Your Highness Aisha has seen you. The 2 people behind Hathaway hurried and immediately saluted Aisha. Then they looked at the place where the 2 people were looking at and suddenly showed a shocked look. Isn't this the executioner? One of them was shocked and said, How could it die here? What happened here? The shock on Hathaway's face had calmed down, and her brows were wrinkled. Both her appearance and the current demeanor were somewhat similar to Aisha's. She showed a thoughtful look and said, There are so many walking dead bodies around, and there are even high-level walking dead like the giant walking dead. Could it be there is a corpse king here? Corpse king? The white-skinned young man who spoke before glared and said, Is it difficult, is it possible that this executioner was eaten by the corpse king? Another middle-aged man with a protruding bone spur on his arm looked ugly and said, If it's the corpse king, it's a big trouble. If it's not the corpse king, it's another monster. Hathaway's eyes flickered slightly and whispered, Other monsters hurt the executioner, and then it met this small group of corpses and was killed. Whiz. When the 3 people communicated, Aisha's figure suddenly descended and landed a few meters above the executioner's body. Several walking dead who were gnawing on the corpse saw Aisha and immediately looked up and roared, reaching for her boot. She held the giant sword on her back, and the bandage was automatically untied. Suddenly, the blood flashed, and the bodies of several walking dead suddenly froze. The next moment, the head slowly slipped from the bridge of the nose, and the cut surface was neat. Hathaway and the other 2 also followed at this moment. Its parasitic soul worm seems to be gone. The previous middle-aged man looked at the corpse and saw that its internal organs had been completely gnawed, and there would be no parasitic soul worm left. Hearing his words, Hathaway bit her teeth slightly and clenched her fingers, but soon loosened and said to Aisha, Sister, it seems that in the wasteland of our dragon clan there is a terrible monster. We have to find it out as soon as possible. Otherwise, other pioneers who are performing tasks outside will fall into the hands of monsters at any time. Aisha didn't hear her words, looked at the corpse for a moment and slowly said, It was killed by the corpse king. This should be a formed corpse king carrying the corpse tied. Luca, you go back immediately and pass down the order. There is a corpse king. Once you see the corpse tied, retreat immediately. Chapter 584. This is a relic? Hearing Eureka's words, the blonde woman and the other 2 were stunned. Dean was slightly startled. He couldn't help but look at the door carefully, and soon noticed a raised stone beside the door. "Be careful," Eureka said with a dignified expression. "There are many kinds of relics. Some have treasures left from the old era, and some are traps with destructive light that can penetrate everything." Destructive light? Dean's heart moved. Was it a laser? He immediately stopped the idea of going forward to explore. If there were really laser weapons in the relics, according to Eureka, it seemed that the energy of the laser weapons was not exhausted, indicating that there was also a solar energy system installed in the relic. However, if Eureka had seen laser weapons, did it mean that the people inside the giant wall also mastered laser weapons? Destructive light? Is it a weapon? Dean asked Eureka on purpose. The blonde woman and the other two also looked at Eureka curiously. "Almost, it should be a kind of weapon from the old era," Eureka said in a deep voice. "Even the pioneers can't avoid it. It's very dangerous." "No way? The people of the old era are so strong. Weren't they exterminated? If there is such a strong power, how could they be exterminated?" The blonde woman and the other two were surprised. Dean's eyes narrowed slightly and he asked Eureka, "Since this weapon is so strong, why didn't you bring it back to the giant wall? Why haven't I heard of it?" Eureka shook his head slightly. "It's useless to dismantle it. After all, it's an old weapon. We don't know how to use it." "I see." Dean was a little relieved. If the people inside the giant wall mastered the laser weapons of the old era, it would be really tricky. Even his new magic couldn't resist it. However, judging from the current situation, the people inside the giant wall should not have such power as laser weapons. Otherwise, it would be enough to deter all the pioneers and command all the pioneers. Obviously, the forces in the inner wall were complicated and not twisted into a rope, which meant that the forces in the inner wall were not loyal to the same person. "Step back a little." Eureka stared at the giant stone door for a moment, and suddenly his eyes moved and he said in a deep voice. Dean and others immediately retreated. Eureka pulled out a dark spear from his back. The body of the spear was engraved with many inscriptions, which looked extremely simple. At this moment, these inscriptions seemed to be the color of burning blood. The body of the spear gradually changed, especially from the hilt that Eureka held in his hand. It gradually dissolved. The spear shaft that had dissolved into a viscous liquid spread along his palm and wrapped around his body like a living liquid. Dean's pupils shrank. Was this a magic weapon? Was this really just a genetic weapon? A moment later, Eureka's whole body was wrapped in the dark red liquid. Sharp thorns and scales protruded from all parts of his body. Behind the armor, the mucus converged and extended to form a tail more than 3 meters long. His body also changed accordingly, and there was a faint cracking sound of bones protruding from his body. His figure also became much taller. The change ended quickly. In the blink of an eye, the handsome Eureka with a scholarly temperament was gone. Instead, a monster with black skin, scales, a black tail, and a head like a lion appeared in front of Dean and others. Dean felt a strong sense of oppression, and there was a shivering feeling of shrinking pores. Intuition told him that the person in front of him was not Eureka, but a real monster. "Step back a little more," the monster said to Dean and others in a hoarse voice. Hearing his voice, Dean's eyes flashed, and he stepped back 7 or 8 meters. After Dean and the others were far away, Eureka took a step forward. A spike protruded from his black arm, which was as thick as an orangutan's. It was half a meter long, and the tip looked like a spear. His figure suddenly flashed, and he slammed into the giant door on the stone wall. The spear-like black spike suddenly stabbed into the gap of the door. Bang! There was a huge shock. The lime sand on the rock wall above everyone's head fell, and a large amount of dust fluttered on the giant stone door. Eureka looked at the front of the black spike, but it did not pierce into the gap of the door. His heart was moved, and he stepped back a few steps. He waved the black spike on the giant stone door, and soon a dent was made and stone chips were flying. After a moment, the dust dispersed. Dean and others suddenly saw that under the black spike on Eureka's arm, lines appeared on the giant stone door. The lines revealed a dark gold color, which seemed to be some kind of metal. Dean was startled, and suddenly realized that this was not a stone door, but a metal door. It was just that the accumulation of dust over the years formed a stone shell on the door. If it's a modern metal gate from the old era, then... Dean's eyes fell on the raised stone next to the gate. He immediately said to Eureka, "General, cut the stone chips there and let's see." Eureka turned his head and glanced at Dean. His dark green eyes flashed slightly. He glanced at the raised stone and jumped over. His arms waved quickly and the stone chips splashed. Soon, the stone chips on the raised stone were all removed, and the shape inside was revealed. It was a metal instrument. Dean saw this metal instrument and his eyes suddenly lit up. This should be the password lock to open the door. Eureka stopped and looked at the metal instrument. Dean waited for a moment, and seeing that no mechanism was triggered, he immediately walked over. Seeing this, the blonde woman and the others also followed. Dean reached out to touch the metal instrument. Chapter 585. Open. Dean was stunned. Eureka, who reacted later, heard the mechanical voice and was shocked. He pulled Dean's body back a few steps. He looked at the metal instrument vigilantly and shouted, "Who are you? Come out." Hearing his words, the blonde woman and the other two were shocked and hurriedly stepped back. They pulled out their weapons and looked at the metal instrument nervously. They didn't expect that there was a person hiding inside, but they couldn't see any clues at all. It was terrible. A person. Dean was stunned for a moment and quickly reacted. He felt funny in his heart and relieved at the same time. It seemed that these people didn't understand English and didn't understand the previous words. This was good, so they wouldn't be suspicious of him. Buzz. At this moment, the ground under everyone's feet suddenly shook, and the dust on the surrounding walls rustled down. "No, it's an earthquake." Eureka's face changed slightly and hurriedly said, "It's going to collapse soon. Leave." Before he finished speaking, he suddenly stopped and looked at the stone door in front of him, stunned. Rumble! The gap in the middle of the stone door slowly split open. In the trembling sound of the ground, it gradually opened to both sides. Thick dust rolled out from under the stone door and rushed toward everyone, making them dusty. "Who?" Suddenly, like a sigh of the wind, came out of the stone door. Soon, the stone door disappeared completely and retracted into the walls on both sides. A lot of rubbed stone chips fell from the walls. In the thick fog of dust, the few of them raised their hands to cover their faces. Squinting their eyes, they peered inside, only to see that the stone door was pitch black, without the slightest bit of light. It was as if a dark, bloody mouth was waiting for them to enter. Eureka, the blonde woman, and others were secretly shocked and didn't dare to move. When Dean saw the open giant door, he was completely shocked. It was really open. Not to mention the fact that there was still energy here, just the opening of this door was too strange. Could it be that the previous scan was not an iris scan? However, he was in his father's research institute since he was a child. He was familiar with iris scanning and fingerprint scanning. The previous scan was clearly an iris scan. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but glance at Eureka, the blonde woman, and the others next to him. He saw that they were nervous and vigilant, and their muscles were tense, as if they were ready to fight with the previous person at any time. This expression did not seem to be fake. He recalled the scene of the previous iris scan. Eureka retreated immediately, and the blonde woman and the other two bowed their heads to protect their heads. It seemed that only he was scanned. In other words, it is the first time for them to come here. The door was opened because it scanned me? Dean was at a loss. Was it related to him? However, he had never been here before. Even before he went into hibernation, He didn't remember that there would be such a thing buried underground. According to the electronic voice from before, this place seemed to be called the shelter? Could it be a place built by the people of the olden era to avoid disaster? When he was puzzled, the thick fog-like dust gradually settled, revealing the scene inside the stone door. Although it was dark, Dean's dark vision could see without hindrance that there were dozens of human skeletons lying on the ground beside the door. The skeletons seemed to have decayed long ago, wrapped in old human clothes. Surprisingly, these clothes were relatively intact and had not been eroded too seriously by time. And the styles of the clothes were various, including dresses, jeans and shirts, long-sleeved shirts and so on. Dean was stunned. These clothes were the most common clothes of the olden era. Could it be that the skeletons on the ground were ordinary people of the olden era? Light the fire. Eureka's voice sounded. The middle-aged man in the blonde woman's group took out a torch from his backpack, poured kerosene on it, and lit it. The faint fire suddenly dispelled the darkness in front of them. The skeletons all over the ground were reflected in their sight, and their faces changed slightly. Eureka's eyes flickered slightly. He glanced at the metal instrument beside the stone door and thought that this should be the device to open the ruins. He turned his head and glanced at Dean, frowning slightly. Did this kid accidentally touch it, or did he already know the use of this device? I didn't expect that this is the thing to open the ruins. Brother Eureka, what kind of ruins do you think it is? Are there any treasures in it? Dean saw Eureka's eyes and immediately showed curiosity and asked him. Hearing Dean's words, Eureka's eyes flickered, and the doubts in his heart were suddenly dispelled. He thought that even if this kid had a good relationship with Her Highness Aisha, he might not know about the ruins. After all, this was the product of the olden era more than 300 years ago. Even Her Highness Aisha was not clear about it, let alone him? It's not clear yet. Eureka took back his eyes and looked at the dark ruins. He said to the middle-aged man holding the torch, "You, go ahead and lead the way." The middle-aged man's face changed, and he hurriedly said, "General, I'm not good at defense, just do as I say." Eureka scolded, and then his tone slowed down a little, and he said indifferently, "In my opinion, this should be a treasure ruins. If there are traps in the dangerous ruins, we will be attacked when the door is opened." The middle-aged man was slightly startled, and he couldn't help but feel moved. But after all, he was a veteran hunter, so he quickly suppressed his greed and thought, "In your opinion? How can my life be used as a scapegoat for you just because of your guess?" "General, my perception is relatively weak. If I go ahead and encounter any danger, I'm afraid I won't be able to perceive it in advance. I'm afraid it will harm everyone." The middle-aged man tried to persuade from a different perspective. When Eureka heard his words, how could he not know what he was thinking? He snorted and said, "I said, there is no danger in here. If you talk more, I'll throw you in directly." The middle-aged man's face was ugly. He knew that things couldn't be changed. He secretly gritted his teeth, held the torch high, and slowly stepped into the ruins. Every step he took made him feel like stepping into a death swamp, and he would fall at any time. Crack, crack. His boots broke the corpses on the ground. The corpses that had lost water were extremely fragile and broke with one step. Dean silently followed in the middle of the team, keeping a distance from Eureka. Although Eureka's attitude towards him had always been relatively peaceful, and he had the task of protecting him, when the real danger came, it was hard to guarantee that Eureka would not grab him and use him as a scapegoat. To survive outside the wall, every step had to rely on wisdom. Soon, all of them entered the ruins. The middle-aged man stepped out of the pile of corpses at the door and slowly went deeper into the darkness in front of the torch. Dean glanced around the ruins with his night vision. He found that the inside of the ruins was an extremely spacious circular hall. Corpses could be seen everywhere on the ground. All of them were wearing the clothes of ordinary people from the old era. In addition to the dozens of skeletons at the entrance, There were even more scattered corpses everywhere in the circular hall. In some corners there were even hundreds of skeletons piled up, like a mountain of corpses. The densely packed skeletons were wrapped in the clothes of the old era, quietly lying there, their empty eye sockets filled with loneliness. Seeing these corpses wearing the clothes of the old era, Dean had an indescribable feeling in his heart, like sadness but also like loneliness. The memories of the old era hidden in the depths of his mind slowly emerged in front of him. However, perhaps it was too long, so that he suddenly felt that what emerged in his mind was only a somewhat vague steel jungle city, and the faces of his father, mother, and sister. In addition, he felt that the impression of other things was a little vague. Had it been so long that it had been forgotten? These corpses, are they the people of the old era? How can there be so many? The blonde woman looked at the corpses around her, among which there were some broken hands and half-bones scattered on the ground. It was the first time for her to see a group of corpses from the old era, and she had a strong sense of shock. The bodies of these people from the old era seemed to be very fragile. The young man on the other side said. He did not avoid stepping on the ribs on the chest of a skeleton, did not choose other footholds, and did not care about the objects under his feet. Even if they have been dead for 300 years, the bones are too powder. I heard that people like us, some of whom have special abilities, have been dead for hundreds of years, and their bones are still as hard as steel. These corpses are at most rubbed with flour. In any era there are weak and strong, and these should be the weak, Eureka said indifferently. He turned his head and looked around, frowning. It was too quiet here, so quiet that there was no sound. Could it be that there were no living things in it at all? Dean heard the words of these people, and took a look at the corpses piled up around him. He was basically sure that this was just a shelter built before the disaster broke out. This could also be seen from the corpses on the ground. Most of these corpses were women and children. It was not a valuable sealed place to hide old technological weapons. He was a little disappointed in his heart, but not too regretful. After all, if there were really high-tech items from the old era, with Eureka they would eventually have to be handed over to the Dragon Clan. If it fell into the hands of the inner wall, it would become a hindrance to his future. It seems that there was a fight here. There are a lot of broken limbs and corpses, the blonde woman said. Dean frowned slightly. He had already noticed this, and then associated it with the environment here. Obviously, these people were the lucky ones selected by the army and sent to this shelter. Most of the fights here were because of food. Could it be that the door can't be opened from inside? Dean looked back at both sides of the door, but did not see the iris scanner. He could not help but frown. If the door couldn't be opened from the inside, causing them to have to compete for food here, that is to say, the people who sent these survivors here were probably planning to wait for the disaster to end, and then they would open it from the outside. The only use of this approach was to avoid some people inside from opening the shelter because of their own reasons and sacrificing everyone. Soon, the middle-aged man went deep into the center of the circular hall with a torch. At this time, Dean passed by a pile of corpses. Because of the angle, he suddenly saw the outline of a door under the gap of the pile of corpses leaning against the wall. From the height, it seemed to be about 3 meters. His gaze focused, and very quickly, he quietly turned his gaze to look around, but with the help of his opened-up vision, he used his peripheral vision to carefully look at the pile of corpses. Very quickly, he discovered that it was not an illusion. There was indeed a door hidden under the pile of corpses. His heart was slightly moved, but he did not tell Eureka and others. On the contrary, he planned to wait for the next time to sneak in and check it out. Anyway, with the size of the ruins, Eureka and others could not move it away. Although he did not know what was in the door, since it was the secret he found, of course, he would not easily share it with others. If there was a treasure hidden inside, it would bring him a fatal disaster. There is a black shadow over there. What is it? Dean immediately pointed to another place and said. Hearing Dean's words, Eureka and the others were shocked and a little nervous, especially the middle-aged man who was leading the way holding the torch. He swallowed his saliva and shone the torch at the place where Dean was pointing. He slowly approached it, only to find that it was just a pile of corpses. He breathed a sigh of relief, and then became a little annoyed. However, thinking of Dean's unknown identity, he resisted the urge to scold him. This place is very big. For now, there should be no danger. Light it up first, Eureka said. Hearing this, Dean thought it was not good. Once it was illuminated, they were likely to find the door. When the blonde woman heard the words, she immediately turned out their own torches and kerosene, ignited them, and inserted them in the surrounding corpses. Several torches and kerosene lamps were lit in the darkness, and the outline of the circular hall was immediately illuminated. It's going to be discovered. Dean saw that the blonde woman and the other two were still lighting new oil dishes. He knew that the door would be exposed sooner or later. He sighed in his heart. It seemed that it was not his own opportunity. He didn't force it. After all, it was inevitable. Caca. Suddenly, outside the gate of the ruins behind them, there were several footsteps, and there was the sound of stones being kicked away and rolling. Everyone was shocked and looked back in an instant. This look, Dean's face suddenly changed. He saw 3 huge figures coming from the entrance of the ruins. They were 3 giant walking dead. No, it's the giant walking dead. He hurriedly cried. Eureka heard Dean's words and his heart moved. This kid's perception was so strong. This idea flashed, and soon, he also saw the 3 giant walking dead that were shaking and gradually accelerating. He was shocked. How could there be 3 giant walking dead here? Could it be that it had followed their scent? Damn it! Eureka bit his teeth slightly and said, "You step back." With that, he bent his body slightly and jumped out. Is it the giant walking dead? The blonde woman hurriedly retreated in fear. This was not a monster they could fight. Chapter 586. Whoosh. After inspiring the magic weapon, Eureka's figure was as fast as a phantom, which was different from before. In a blink of an eye, he came to the front of 3 giant walking dead, and all the corpses along the way were trampled into powder. He suddenly waved the spear-like dark weapon on his arm that was integrated with his body and jumped up to stab the head of a male giant walking dead. Suddenly, the vascular tissue of the male giant walking dead was extremely flexible. He twisted his head in a thrilling way to avoid Eureka's attack, but his cheek was scratched with a blood stain. Eureka missed a blow and his body instantly rushed up. His tail wrapped around the waist of the male giant walking dead, and his body stepped on its abdomen and quickly climbed to its shoulder, like a dexterous monkey. The giant walking dead roared and waved to grab him, but touched nothing. Eureka was like a flexible loach. Roar. The half-meter-long neck on the shoulder of the giant walking dead twisted to bite him. Eureka's dark green eyes narrowed and waited for a moment. At the moment when it was about to bite his body, the spear on his arm suddenly pierced out, penetrated through its mouth, and came out from the back of its head. All of this happened in an instant. It was only 2 or 3 seconds before and after that, a giant walking dead fell to the ground and died. Seeing this, Dean and the blonde woman were relieved at the same time, and there was some shock in their eyes. After inspiring the magic weapon, Eureka's speed and strength obviously rose more than 1 level. Is this the power of the magic weapon? Dean's eyes flashed with a strange light, and he quietly clenched his hand. After a giant walking dead was solved, the remaining 2 immediately rushed to Eureka at the same time, but their speed was a little slow and clumsy in front of Eureka, and they never touched his body. Occasionally, the sharp claws scratched, but they were blocked by the dark scales on Eureka's body, causing no harm. Dean observed the rare pioneer battle scene. He had to say that Eureka's fighting ability was extremely strong. With a flexible body, in the case of 1 versus 2, he still firmly occupied the upper hand, without any injury on his body. Instead, he caused more and more wounds on the chest and neck of the two giant walking dead. Although these wounds did not affect the action of the giant walking dead, it was enough to see that Eureka fought with ease and terrifying strength. This giant walking dead is no different from the ordinary walking dead, but its physique is stronger. It still relies on instinct to fight. It has no rules and skills. It will only attack. Dean observed and noticed that the fighting style of the two giant walking dead was very simple, without any fighting skills. Eureka bit his teeth and said in a deep voice, "You guys protect Dean for me. If he has an accident, you don't want to live. Do you know?" The blonde woman and the other two looked ugly. They couldn't help but look at Dean next to them. There was some resentment and annoyance in their hearts. The wasteland was not a place to play. Obviously, they were distinguished, but they had to come to such a place to suffer. Didn't they have nothing to do? Dean noticed the resentment in the eyes of the three people and knew that he had become a burden to them. He didn't say anything, but secretly paid attention to prevent the three people from pushing him out to be a scapegoat when they encountered a fatal danger. After all, the order was the order. Who knew if they would obey it? Kill! After Eureka gave the order, he growled like a black lion, crouched on the ground and rushed into the zombies. This was the only way to the outside, so he had to kill his way out as soon as possible. Otherwise, it would be difficult for him to get away when the zombies gathered. "Follow us," the blonde woman and the other two said to Dean, and their tone was a little cold. The three formed a triangular lineup, with Dean in the middle, and followed Eureka. Soon, several people collided with the walking dead in the passage, and the battle broke out in an instant. Eureka shot like electricity, waving the dark spear on his arm to kill quickly. In this group battle, he no longer pursued to kill these walking dead, only to repel them. Therefore, the place of attack was no longer seeking their heads, but the joints such as limbs. As a result, the battle became more and more fierce, like a humanoid tank crashing into a pile of corpses. 7 or 8 strange-shaped corpses were immediately picked up. The triangular lineup formed by the blonde woman and the other two protected Dean and followed Eureka, blocking the corpses that were shot back again. After all, the three were dragon guards. In addition to the high-level corpses such as the giant walking dead, other ordinary corpses and sickle corpses were easily killed in their hands like cutting melons and vegetables. Some heads fell, and some were kicked back into the corpse tide. After rushing into the corpse tide for more than 10 meters, a giant walking dead that was repelled by Eureka climbed up from the ground and rushed toward Dean and others behind him. The blonde woman and the other two were pale with fright and hurriedly shouted, "General!" When Eureka heard the sound, he looked back and roared fiercely. He jumped up and threw himself on the giant walking dead. The tail quickly wrapped around the blood vessel tissue on its neck. The scales on the tail suddenly stood up, like a sharp blade. As the tail tightened, the blade continued to cut into its neck. The blood flowed out and froze the scales on its tail into white frost crystals. His body was also caught by the giant walking dead, and he had to fight back. At this time, the rest of the walking dead rushed toward Dean and others. In addition to the sickle corpses, there was a carrion walking dead with a bloated body. The hunting level was 42, and it was extremely powerful. It knocked the middle-aged man on the left side of the lineup and leaned toward Dean in the encirclement. Dean immediately stretched out his hand to hold his back. His elbow slightly shook to offset the impact of the impact. After the middle-aged man's body stabilized, he immediately waved his knife and pierced into the body of the carrion walking dead. The blade easily penetrated its body. However, when the middle-aged man wanted to pull out the knife, he couldn't pull it out. At this moment, in the bloated abdomen of the carrion walking dead, a huge mouth full of strange teeth suddenly opened and bit toward the middle-aged man. "Be careful!" The young man next to him hurriedly pulled out his sword and stabbed it to the abdomen. Whoosh! At the same time as he pulled out his sword, a black figure suddenly jumped out of the corpse group and rushed toward the back of the young man from the other side. Suddenly, the young man who could not react fell to the ground, pressed on him and bit his face desperately. Dean and the blonde woman looked at it, and their faces suddenly changed. They saw that it was a lizard-like walking dead with scales all over its body, and its feet had degenerated into a tail. It was one of the high-level walking dead, the strange walking dead, a hunting level of 46. No, no! The young man pushed with all his might, but his face was torn into a bloody mess by a few short claws sticking out from under its throat. Puff, a black shadow suddenly flashed, wrapped around the neck of the strange walking dead on the young man's body, pulled its body up and fell heavily to the ground. It was Eureka who broke away from the giant walking dead. "Keep up!" Eureka screamed and rushed forward. The blonde woman hurriedly put her hand to pull the young man up from the ground. Suddenly, she felt that her foot was held by a hand. Looking down, it was an ordinary walking dead that had been cut into 2 pieces by herself. She was annoyed and lifted her foot to step on its head. Puff, the head burst open, revealing the hardened brain tissue inside. She kicked the walking dead away. Puff, the walking dead's shoulder was broken, and the body flew into the corpse group, but the arm was still clasped on her ankle. At this moment, she had no time to squat down and pull the walking dead's hand down. She could only ignore it and rush behind Eureka. Soon, under the leadership of Eureka, several people killed a way out of the corpse group, climbed along the steep slope, and climbed to the outside. Roar! Roar! As soon as they came to the ground, before they had time to see the surroundings, they heard a deafening roar. Hearing the hoarse roar, Dean couldn't help but feel a tremor in his heart. He looked up, and his face suddenly changed, full of strong shock. He saw the walking dead wandering around the gravel, and the number was very large. In the open space hundreds of meters away in front, thousands of walking dead were wandering here. Some of the walking dead were even larger than the giant walking dead, but the body was not like a human, but like a giant elephant, extremely bloated. The tremor that several people heard in the ground was the sound caused by the walking dead. "This is the corpse tide?" Dean felt a little shocked. It was the first time he saw so many walking dead, and their postures were strange. There were many strange walking dead. The so-called strange walking dead was not the name of a certain walking dead, but a general term, referring to the walking dead whose body was transformed. "Run!" Eureka growled and rushed to a place where there were fewer zombies. He was like a mad lion, opening the way in front of him, knocking away all the zombies that came to him. Dean and the blonde woman and others immediately followed and rushed at full speed. The ordinary corpses behind them could not keep up with the speed of several people, and were suddenly thrown far away. However, in the wandering corpses around, there was a very fast and incomparable corpses, with strange postures. Some were like spiders, with 3 or 4 arms under the armpits, crawling to chase. Some were like the lizard-like corpses that had been killed before, crawling on the ground at a very fast speed, and there were thin wings on the back, flying to chase at low altitude. Dean saw that one of the undeads was wearing a broken armor. The armor was covered with dust and blood, but he could vaguely see a fragment of a dragon pattern. It turned out to be a dragon warrior who had been infected into an undead. At this moment, the walking dead with the broken armor was chasing after them at a very fast speed. In a blink of an eye, it was close to Dean and others. "Damn it!" the blonde woman screamed angrily. Eureka turned his head and saw that there were 7 or 8 walking dead behind him. He was shocked. While waving his arms to hit 2 walking dead, he glanced around and suddenly saw a large number of walking dead scattered nearby, wandering aimlessly, and the number was extremely large. How can there be so many high-level walking dead? Is it a medium-sized corpse tide? Eureka looked ugly, clenched his teeth, and increased his speed by 30% again. At this time, the injured young man fell behind the team and was immediately overtaken by the walking dead with the broken armor. He fell to the ground and had no resistance. The rest of the chasing walking dead smelled the blood and immediately rushed over. "Ah, Desh!" the young man screamed in pain, full of extreme panic. "General!" the blonde woman hurriedly shouted. Eureka had noticed the things behind and said in a deep voice, "I can't save him, keep up, I have to speed up again." Chapter 587. Run! Seeing that the young man was dead, Dean's face changed slightly, and he immediately shouted to the blonde woman and the middle-aged man. At the same time, he suddenly sped up, passed the two in an instant, and followed Eureka closely. His figure was as flexible as a fish, avoiding the attack of a fish that escaped the net. Although it was a low-rank sickle zombie that rushed at him and he could kill it with one punch, it would affect his speed. In such a tide of corpses, once he was entangled, even a pioneer could not escape death. The blonde woman and the middle-aged man looked at the scene of the young man being eaten by several walking dead, and their faces were ugly. Although they did not have a deep friendship with the young man, after all, they were comrades in arms, and it was inevitable that they had some grief and indignation. At this moment, hearing Dean's shout, the two immediately came back to their senses. Seeing that the number of walking dead rushing from all directions was increasing, the grief and indignation in their hearts were suddenly replaced by fear. "Run!" The two did not dare to stay, and quickly turned and ran. While running at full speed, they could not help but secretly pray, hoping that a few fast high-level walking dead behind could eat the young man's body for a while, so that they could catch up a little later. Roar! Roar! The surrounding walking dead gradually gathered towards them, and the roar was like a tide, making people tremble. Eureka was extremely fast in front of them, rushing like a raging beast, knocking all the walking dead in front of him. His tail, arms, head, and whole body seemed to be turned into weapons, like a galloping black tank. The blonde woman and the middle-aged man galloped with all their strength, only to feel that their legs were running fast and not listening to their own brain. But even so, the two watched Eureka in front of them getting farther and farther away. At the same time, the two suddenly found that Dean, who needed their protection before, burst out at a speed that was far beyond them, always following behind Eureka like a shadow. There was a trace of shock in the eyes of the two. Was this young man so strong? Roar! A low roar came from behind, and the tremor of the ground behind them was getting closer and closer. The blonde woman and the middle-aged man felt a chill in their hearts. They immediately knew that there were several walking corpses behind them that were extremely fast. This made their hair stand up and they were frightened. There was no doubt that once they were entangled by these walking corpses, Eureka, who was rushing forward crazily at this moment, would not turn back to save them. After all, they were not as lucky as Dean, and they did not have a formidable background. Both of them were filled with fear and even despair. "Run, my legs!" the middle-aged man cried out in grief and indignation. Fear crawled onto his face. As death approached, his speed increased again. His strong desire to live made him burst forth with a speed that he had never reached before. But even so, he suddenly saw that the golden-haired woman beside him actually burst out with a speed that was faster than him, and actually slowly surpassed him by 1 or 2 steps. Wasn't speed not her forte? The middle-aged man's mind buzzed and went blank. Suddenly, he heard a roar coming from behind him. In the blink of an eye, it appeared not far from the back of his head. It seemed the walking corpse was following closely behind him. His face was full of fear, and he turned his head with difficulty. At the same time as he turned his head, a blood-red giant mouth suddenly bit his face. Flop! Dean heard the sound of wrestling coming from behind, and the excited roar of the walking corpse. He could not help but change his face slightly. He did not look back, which would affect his speed, but he slightly tilted his head, so that his wide field of vision could see the situation behind him. Suddenly, he saw that the middle-aged man had been thrown to the ground by several strange walking corpses. He was struggling desperately, pushing a few walking corpses, but after all, he only had 2 hands, and there were 4 or 5 walking corpses on him. At this moment, there were more walking corpses gathered over, and soon he was drowned. A scream that just opened and stopped abruptly came from the back of the walking corpse pile. At the same time, the walking corpses that crawled outside the walking corpse pile and could not get in immediately loosened, changed their target and continued to chase them. Dean's face was ugly. In the moment of life and death, he suddenly felt that nothing was important. It was the best to be able to live. "Dean, give me a hand." At this time, the blonde woman behind begged Dean while chasing at full speed. Her blonde hair was messy and covered her face, which was pitiful. Dean glanced at her with the corner of his eyes and hesitated. At this moment, he was more than 10 meters away from her. If he wanted to pull her, he had to slow down by 10 meters. Although it only took a pause of less than 0.1 seconds, once the speed was reduced, it was not as simple as 0.1 seconds to sprint for another 10 meters. "Sorry." He bowed his head slightly and said, and then ran at full speed, following Eureka. Hearing Dean's words, the blonde woman's face changed, and her pleading eyes flashed a touch of resentment. At this moment, there was a burst of roar behind her, and the speed was strange, getting closer and closer to her. Her pupils shrank, and she instinctively had an impulse to look back, but this would undoubtedly affect her speed. She clenched her teeth and pleaded loudly to Dean without looking back. "Please, we have been protecting you all the way. Can't you pull me? I beg you, just give me a hand. I'll make love to you when we get back. I'll use my body to repay you. You can do whatever you want, please." Dean gritted his teeth slightly and continued to run. Seeing that Dean's speed did not slow down at all, the blonde woman was completely desperate. At the same time, a bloody claw slammed on her shoulder. In an instant, her mind was blank. Then, 4 or 5 sharp claws stretched out from behind her and grabbed her shoulders, some pressed her head, and some hugged her waist. With a plop, her body, which was running at full speed, was suddenly pulled. The next moment, she was dragged into the zombies behind her. Her ears were full of roars, and the sky disappeared in an instant, covered by ugly and hideous faces. Hearing the screams behind him, Dean's face changed slightly. He knew it was the blonde woman without looking. He clenched his teeth slightly and did not look back. He exhausted his endurance to maintain the full speed at the moment and followed behind Eureka. "Get out, get out, get out!" Eureka roared and rushed forward, quickly knocking away the zombies that rushed toward him, and abruptly opened a bloody road that stretched for several miles. However, even though he had rushed thousands of meters away from the zombie horde, he still did not feel happy in his heart, because within his sight there were still a large number of scattered zombies. Wasn't the scale of the zombie horde too big this time? However, fortunately, he felt that Dean was still following him. As for the other 3 people who died one after another, although they slightly stimulated his nerves, they did not let him care. For many years in the wasteland, he had been accustomed to the death of his comrades and companions. It was not a habit but a numbness. As long as Dean could live, then he wouldn't be punished by Aisha. Judging from the previous secret explanation, he knew that Aisha was not joking this time. "If you want to live, keep up with me." Eureka roared and knocked away a giant walking dead in front of him, rushing quickly. Dean saw the giant walking dead again, and his whole body was covered with goosebumps. He hurriedly stimulated the whole body strength and entered the primary limitless mode. A large number of white bones exuded under the skin, covering the whole body. At the same time, his speed broke out again, and instantly rushed out like a cannonball, biting the position of less than 5 meters behind Eureka. This distance was the limit. If he was pulled away again, he was very likely to lose Eureka. At that time, he could only open the way by himself or stimulate his wings, but if he used the wings to fly, it was no longer a matter of exposure, but even if he used the wings to fly, he might not be able to rush out of the zombies alive. The two flew at full speed along a straight line. The zombies wandering around quickly gathered towards the two. The strange walking dead that ate the blonde woman in the rear also chased again, but their speed was a little slower than Dean's, and they could barely follow the rear of hundreds of meters away. Eureka looked at the front while rushing, and suddenly found that the number of walking dead was less than a kilometer away. His eyes were bright, and he finally rushed to the edge of the corpse tide. Fortunately, this corpse tide is not fully formed. If it is to maintain the scale of the corpse tide, it will be really dangerous this time. Eureka secretly breathed a sigh of relief, thinking like this. Whoosh! Suddenly, a sound of breaking through the air came at a high speed. The sound was like a bee, screaming and harsh. Eureka was stunned suddenly, only to feel the hairs on his body stand up instantly, and could not help but turn his head. Puff! A black spear fell from the sky, like a black lightning, pierced from his shoulder at the moment when he turned his head, and the strong impact drove his body, instantly nailed to the ground a few meters away in front of him, splashing a big pit. Dean, who was behind Eureka, was shocked. He did not react at all. When he heard the sound, he saw that Eureka in front of him had been taken out by a black object. Spear. When Eureka was nailed, Dean suddenly saw that his shoulder was pierced by a black spear more than 2 meters long, and his body was nailed to the black soil. Eureka coughed up a mouthful of blood, and there was some shock and a trace of fear in his eyes. He turned his head and suddenly saw the dark sky behind him. A dark figure was flying, and there was a pair of huge wings on its back. However, the wings were broken, like the fallen angel depicted in the monastery Bible. Is the Bible true? Such a strange idea emerged in his mind, but it was only a flash, and it was destroyed by reason and pain. His pupils narrowed slightly, and his high-power vision magnified at this moment, and he instantly saw the face of the black figure flying over. At the moment of seeing clearly, his face was full of shock, and he said, "Corpse King?" When Dean saw the black spear on Eureka, he had already looked back and soon noticed the black figure flying in the distance. His thermal vision did not see the slightest heat source on the latter. He was shocked in his heart. Is it a strong wing clan? Soon, he heard Eureka's shocked cry, and his heart suddenly trembled. Corpse King? There is a Corpse King here? He learned some information about the Corpse King from Ian and others. In the past 2 days in the fortress, he also read about the Corpse Tide and the Corpse King from the book. Legend has it that the Corpse King is the final form of the Walking Dead. It is relatively easy to meet in the Corpse Tide, but it is not absolute. Not all the Corpse Tides will be mixed with the Corpse King, but the Corpse King must come from the Corpse Tide. Moreover, the Corpse King's hunting level is the same as the monsters. It is not fixed. The Corpse King has strong and weak ones. The strong ones can easily kill the pioneers, and the weak ones are comparable to the pioneers. Dean did not expect to meet a Corpse King here. Eureka is only a pioneer, and the Corpse King can also call the Walking Dead, and even control the Walking Dead. He is not Eureka's opponent at all. Puff! Eureka, who was nailed to the ground by the black spear, suddenly jumped with his hands on the ground, and immediately pulled his body out along the end of the spear. He turned around and continued to run forward. Dean was startled and hurried to follow him. However, this time Eureka ran faster than before. With Dean's full burst of speed, he could not catch up and was thrown more than 10 meters away in an instant. Dean's face changed. He suddenly realized that Eureka should be aware of the danger of life, so he broke out with extraordinary speed. In other words, at this time, Eureka would no longer care about him. He clenched his teeth and immediately stimulated the wings on his back. As the wings unfolded, he immediately flapped his wings to push his body and followed Eureka. He did not dare to fly high in the sky. The Corpse King behind him had wings. If he also flew high in the sky, it would inevitably attract its attention. At that time, he would use his life to buy time for Eureka to escape. While running at full speed, Dean always paid attention to the back of the Corpse King, in case the Corpse King used a long-range attack again. If he was hit by the spear, He might be killed on the spot. Whoosh! Dean was praying, and a sound of breaking air came again. Dean suddenly saw a black shadow flying toward him. His pupils shrank and his body hurriedly dodged, but his body seemed to become sluggish. Puff! A black bead brushed past his shoulder and shot into the ground. Dean was so scared that he was in a cold sweat and rushed at full speed. Bang! Suddenly, the ground under Dean's feet rumbled. His pupils shrank, and he hurriedly looked at the front where the vibration was the strongest, and suddenly saw a terrible scene. He saw the ground under Eureka, who was running at full speed in front of him, burst open, and a giant hand stretched out from it. The width of the palm was nearly 2 meters. It caught Eureka, who was running at full speed, and held him in the palm. At the same time, in the ground under the palm, the soil cracked open rapidly, and an extremely huge figure sat up from it, covering the sky and the light in an instant. Dean was dumbfounded. This is a supergiant walking dead. In addition to the terrible size gap, the body structure was similar to that of the giant walking dead that Dean had seen before, but the chest and back protruded with several skin-colored spikes, which looked a bit ferocious. Chapter 588. When Dean was stunned, Eureka's scream suddenly sounded. He saw his body was tightly held by the palm of the supergiant walking dead, and his arms and legs were all tightly bound. Only a dark tail was swinging at the lower edge of the palm. The sharp part of the tail end hooked to the back of the palm and deeply penetrated into it. But the supergiant walking dead obviously had no pain, and the palm was just tighter and tighter. Gotcha! The sound of broken bones sounded, and Eureka couldn't help but scream loudly. The tail that pierced into the giant palm was so painful that it softened and shook in the air like a cramp. Soon, the sound of broken bones became more and more intensive. Eureka struggled fiercely, but he couldn't make any effort. After a while, Dean saw that while he screamed, a lot of blood suddenly gushed out of his mouth, and a lot of blood overflowed from his ears, eyes, and nostrils. Soon, the scream stopped abruptly. With a bang, the huge palm suddenly clenched, and thick blood gushed out from its clenched palm, splashing all over the hand. In the next moment, the supergiant walking dead loosened its hand, and the sticky broken body organs slipped from its palm one by one. It raised it to the mouth and stretched out a giant tongue with dense eyes and sharp teeth to lick it. Then it slowly moved its eyes and looked at another small figure in front of it. Dean's throat rolled and his mind was a little blank. All this was slow, but in fact, it was only 2 or 3 seconds. Eureka was dead. As a pioneer and one of the 8 generals who guarded the wasteland, he died so easily. The fear that he had never had gripped his heart tightly, and he even forgot to breathe. At this moment, he suddenly thought that if God let him return to the giant wall, he would rather live there forever in this life and never step out again. When death stood in front of him and he was powerless to resist, he realized that life was so insignificant and self-respect was so worthless. The so-called meaning of living was just a stupid and childish idea of having nothing better to do. Just being able to live on was already a wonderful thing. Whoosh! A whistling sound flew over and stopped above Dean's head. Dean's whole body was covered with goosebumps, and the blood in his body seemed to be frozen. He dared not have the slightest movement. He slowly moved his eyes and suddenly saw the corpse king with 2 broken wings on the back behind him. It was above his head. He was looking down at her from high above. Fear and despair. When these 2 situations appeared at the same time, what would be left in the brain? Was it blank? Who? The corpse king's figure slowly descended, a gentle breeze brought about by the flapping of its wings, but the breeze was mixed with the stench of rotting corpses. The next moment, Dean heard the ground behind his body tremble slightly. At the same time, the cold breath with the smell of blood and corpses blew from the back of his neck. It seemed that the king of corpses was standing behind him, watching him. Dean's heartbeat suddenly stopped. Time seemed to suddenly slow down, and the air was so quiet that not a single sound could be heard. He would definitely die. These 4 words appeared in his mind. There was no doubt that this kind of self-judgment would cause one to feel despair, but at the same time, there seemed to be a kind of courage in his heart. Since he was going to die, what was there to be afraid of? He clenched his fist, turned around abruptly, and punched behind him. Bang! His fist smashed into a hard object, but it wasn't an absolutely hard object like metal. Instead, it was a kind of toughness that was 10,000 times stronger than rubber. His fist was hitting the chest of the corpse king behind him. At this moment, a man and a corpse were facing each other. At this moment, Dean also saw the face of the king of corpses. Its pupils were pure black, without a trace of white. There were several scars on its face. It seemed that it was left not long ago. There was no trace of anger or emotion on its face. Bang! Suddenly, Dean could only see a vague black afterimage, which seemed to be the fist of the corpse king. The next moment, the pain hit his entire chest, and the signal conveyed by the pain nerves occupied all his consciousness. His body flew straight back, as if flying into space. His body could not feel gravity at all, until there was a sharp pain in his back again, and he hit something. He coughed up a mouthful of blood, and felt a burning sensation in his chest, as if he was suffocating. He forced himself to look up and immediately discovered that the scenery around him was slowly sinking. To be precise, it was his body that was automatically rising. He suddenly looked back and suddenly found himself in the palm of the super-giant Walking Dead. At this moment, the Walking Dead was holding himself and sending him into its open bloody mouth. In the dark giant mouth, there were sharp teeth, and one of the sharp teeth was also clamped with a piece of dark thing, which was a broken thigh of Eureka. No. Dean's pupils dilated. Whoosh! Suddenly, a whistle-like sharp whistling sound flew over and streaked across the distant horizon. When Dean heard the whistling, a strong wind suddenly came from behind, flattening his hair on the back of his head, and his broken armor was fluttering. At the same time, a blood-red light flashed over the top of his head, like a red lightning into the bloody mouth of the super-giant Walking Dead. With a bang, Dean felt the giant palm that held him. The next moment, the ground behind the super-giant Walking Dead made a huge roar. Dean couldn't help but look at it and suddenly stood on the spot. He saw a glimmer of light in the dark giant mouth of the super-giant Walking Dead, and the depth of the giant mouth was penetrated. Whoosh! Whoosh! At the same time, several flying sounds came at a high speed. Dean only felt that his whole body was light, and a soft palm grabbed his arm and took it to the sky. He couldn't help but turn his head and suddenly saw a familiar face, Aisha. "Are you okay?" Aisha looked at him, and there was a deep meaning in her eyes. Dean's stiff thinking slowly recovered. After a moment, he suddenly thought of the corpse king behind and immediately said, "Be careful, the corpse king is still there." "It's okay," Aisha whispered, and her body fell rapidly and landed on the ground. At the same time, the rumbling sound behind her sounded. Dean looked back and suddenly saw the previous supergiant Walking Dead fall down and hit the ground, raising a lot of dust. When the dust came, Dean felt that Aisha released him, and immediately stood firm. At the same time, he used the dragon blood technique. She taught him to control the heart, change the direction of blood flow, stop the blood in the chest, and then use a small amount of blood to gently soothe the past, slowly heal. "You rest here, I will solve it soon." Aisha's voice came from the side of the dust. As her words fell, a gust of wind rolled up and blew the dust away. She was holding a blood-red giant sword, dragging it from the ground and walking toward the corpse king step by step. Whoosh! Whoosh! At the same time, several figures in the sky came and landed on the side of Aisha. Dean was stunned. Is Hathaway also here? Hathaway had noticed Dean for a long time. When she saw Dean looking at her, a sly color flashed in her eyes. She naughtily spit her tongue at Dean. This clever behavior was the same as when she was dating Dean when she played Aisha. Dean was startled and slightly wrinkled his eyebrows. I didn't expect you to be here too. You didn't die when you met the Corpse King and the giant god corpse. Gee, you are really lucky, Hathaway said to Dean with a smile. Dean's face sank slightly and he was silent. After all, you are still too tender. You were so scared that you couldn't walk before. You actually watched the giant god corpse eat you. You are really cowardly. Hathaway showed her white teeth and said with a smile, in the knight's poem, the hero saves the beauty. When it comes to us, it becomes the beauty saves the bear. Sister, it seems that you are better than me in everything, but your eyes are much worse than mine. Shut up. Aisha turned her head and looked at her coldly. Hathaway shrugged slightly. That's the truth. Before she finished her words, she suddenly stopped. A wisp of cold air was on her neck. It was the tip of the blood-red giant sword in Aisha's hand. A middle-aged man next to her saw the stiff atmosphere and quickly said, Your Highness Aisha, Your Highness Hathaway is just a joke. Don't mind it. Let's solve this Corpse King first. Aisha snorted coldly and took back the giant sword. She looked up and stared at the Corpse King walking slowly in front of her. Her eyes flickered slightly. The smile on Hathaway's face had long disappeared. She was expressionless. She turned her head silently and looked at the Corpse King. Then she said, The executioner was killed by it. There is still the smell of the executioner on its body. Her voice was clear, and there was no childish appearance of the previous smile. Dean was shocked. The executioner was killed? And it was by the Corpse King in front of him? Reynolds, you stay and take care of him, Aisha said to the middle-aged man. The middle-aged man was slightly startled. He was a pioneer, but he stayed to protect this young man? However, thinking that the two sisters actually quarreled and even pulled out their swords for this young man, he couldn't help but look at Dean. His appearance could only be regarded as delicate, not a rare handsome appearance. The heat source in his body was also ordinary. He was just at the limited level. There was nothing outstanding about him. He frowned and said to Aisha, Your Highness, this Corpse King can kill the executioner. It should be a relatively strong Corpse King. If I don't help, no need for you. Aisha interrupted him. You take care of him. This Corpse King is stronger than you think. It's not something that ordinary pioneers can intervene in. Hathaway, come and help me. End the battle as soon as possible so that the corpse tide doesn't gather. Hathaway pretended to be surprised and said, Sister, I'm just an ordinary pioneer. Aren't you afraid that I'll be in danger? Aisha glanced at her and said, You'd better stimulate the magic weapon. Otherwise, you'll die if your blood is awakened. Hathaway pouted slightly, showing a reluctant expression, but there was a hint of seriousness in her eyes. She pulled out the giant spear on her back and clenched her fingers tightly. The body of the spear slowly melted, and like wax, it crawled along her arm and covered her entire body. In an instant, she turned into a 3-meter-tall demonic dragon with a pair of dark red wings and a huge dragon tail. But compared with the real demonic dragon, it was a bit like a human, such as the upright posture, the arms similar to human arms, and the upright chest. Aisha stared at the Corpse King. Seeing that it didn't immediately launch an attack, she suddenly thought of something. She turned her head and looked around. Suddenly, she saw the surrounding corpses slowly gathering. Her face sank. Obviously, when they were talking, the Corpse King didn't take the opportunity to launch an attack. It wasn't gentlemanly etiquette, but it sensed that the enemy was unusual and took the opportunity to summon the corpse tide. Attack! Aisha made a prompt decision. She shouted and suddenly rushed straight up, rolling up a cloud of dust on the ground along the way. Hathaway followed her without saying anything. After using the magic weapon to enter the full combat state, her explosive speed was comparable to Aisha's. Almost at the same time, she rushed to the front of the Corpse King. The two seemed to have a tacit understanding. They suddenly separated and then attacked the Corpse King from the left and right. Let's retreat first. Reynolds, who was ordered to protect Dean, immediately retreated with Dean. Even without Aisha's words, he knew that his participation in this battle would have little effect, and the possibility of sacrifice was extremely high. He knew this when he saw the giant god's corpse. The general corpse king didn't have the protection of the giant god's corpse. The power of the giant god's corpse alone couldn't be matched by a pioneer. At least 2 or 3 pioneers were needed to kill it. "I heard that Eureka is with you. Where is he?" Reynolds asked Dean while retreating. Dean looked at the battle in front of him without squinting. His face changed slightly when he heard the words. He whispered, "He was eaten by the giant god's corpse." "What?" Reynolds was shocked. He couldn't help but look up at the giant god's corpse. He suddenly noticed that one of its palms was stained with blood. His face suddenly changed. Roar! Roar! At this time, there was a roar around them. A large number of walking dead gathered from all directions. Many of them were extremely fast, and they rushed toward Dean and Aisha. Reynolds's face sank. He pulled out his sword and cut off the necks of several walking dead that rushed over. After repelling a few walking dead, Reynolds saw Dean's pale face, and then looked at his chest, which had completely collapsed. Presumably, many of his ribs were broken. He immediately took out a small bottle from his waist bag and said, "Take one of the healing pills inside." Dean listened to him, took a look, took out a pill and swallowed it. As the pill entered his mouth, he suddenly felt that the burning pain in his chest was reduced a lot. At the same time, the exhausted power in his body was gradually recovering. He was surprised. He didn't expect the effect of the pill to be so fast. It was worthy of the healing medicine carried by the pioneers. He sighed in his heart. He quickly controlled his heart and accelerated the recovery of the chest injury with the effect of the pill. At the same time, he divided part of his attention to the battlefield in front of him. Boom! 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 Aisha and Hathaway were fighting with the Corpse King. The speed of the three was extremely fast, like a stream of light. Every time they landed, the ground trembled violently, as if hit by a boulder weighing thousands of pounds. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.